Good morning and welcome to the 15th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. The first item on our agenda today is to consider three negative instruments, and the first is Town and Country Planning Fees for Appeals Scotland Regulations 2025, SSI 2025/124. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? Well, I have some comments on two of the instruments, but in this case, I'm a bit concerned about SMEs and community-led housing being caught up in this. And while I think before my time in this Parliament, there was discussion during the Planning Act that fees would be something that would be coming along, I'd be interested in hearing from the Minister about how we handle the situation for for SME construction companies and also developers and also community-led housing. So I'd be interested in hearing more from the Minister on that, and actually another SSI that we're going to talk to, which is SSI 126. Mark.
Thanks, Convener. I think it's right. I think we should have the Minister, and I share your concerns about impact on SME developers in particular, and a concern that we are potentially pricing them out of the appeals system. I think I would maybe feel differently if developers were just submitting appeals for every application that was refused and then being rejected on appeal, but the figures are showing that over 50% are approved on appeal. So I'm worried that we're really the effect of these fees could be constraining the pipeline of housing delivery at a really critical time. So I do have some concern, and I think it'd be right to hear from the Minister on those.
Yeah, certainly. I think it would be good. I mean, we also equally know, being the Planning Committee, the challenges in planning. So I think it would be good to hear about how the Minister's plan to balance that. Megan.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just to agree with the comments that have been put forward already, we are, of course, in a housing emergency that has been acknowledged not just by councils up and down the country, but here in the Scottish Parliament as well. I think I particularly agree with the comments that Mark Griffin made regarding SMEs. We don't want them priced out of development. We need to make sure that developments can happen across the country in areas that are suitable and appropriate to take place. So on that basis, I do believe that we should have the Minister in to further discuss this matter and ask questions to him. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. The second of the negative instruments is the Town and Country Planning Fees for Applications Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025, SSI 2025/125. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? Okay. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. And the third instrument is the Town and Country Planning Fees for Local Reviews, Scotland Regulations 2025, SSI 2025/126. Do members have any comments on this instrument? Mark.
Just on a similar basis to my previous comments, I think it would be helpful to receive a response from the Minister in charge.
Thank you. Anybody else? I think we're agreed. We would like to hear from the Minister. Okay, thank you. And that ends that item on the SSIs, and we'll arrange to bring the Minister in next week. The second item on our agenda this morning is consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill at Stage 2, Day 4. And I welcome to the meeting the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and her officials. We're also joined both online and in the room by other members of the Scottish Parliament who have lodged amendments to the bill and are present to debate those with us today. Members wishing to speak should indicate by catching my or the clerk's attention. The voting is by a show of hands, and it's important that members keep their hands raised until the clerk has recorded their names. That's especially important for colleagues online, and I'll let you know when we have counted your vote. We will not dispose of any amendments beyond the end of Part 3 of the bill today. At previous meetings, we have explained the procedure we will be following, and I propose to move straight into consideration of amendments today. Is this one right? Okay. So I call Amendment 218 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings, and I remind members that Amendments 138 and 161 are direct alternatives. That is, they can both be moved and decided on. The text of whichever is the last agreed to is what will appear in the bill. And I point out that if Amendment 37 in the group rent control areas changes to between tenancy rent controls is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 162 or 202 due to preemption. And I believe that Alexander Stewart is going to move Amendment 218 on behalf of Rachel Hamilton. So Alexander Stewart to move Amendment 218 and speak to all amendments, or as many as you want to, in the group.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Happy to move Amendment 218. It's a consequential amendment for 219. 219, Amendment 219 introduces flexibility to adjust rent mid-tenancy in response to significant changes in circumstances. This is particularly relevant in cases where an employee leaves their job but remains within the property as the tenant, and a successor takes over the tenancy after a death, moving from a nominal rent linked to the employment within the market rent. Where rent does need to be raised because of circumstances considered by ministers for an emergency, the amendment would enable to be done so that in increased manner, removing the limitation for the number of times rents can be increased. And consequently, 220 is an amendment that was 214 previously debated. Amendment 220 also amends new sections for 43J to the same effect, with the tenancy situated in the rent control area. Others within the group, 138, 161, 162, 201, 202, 294 and 495, rent increase appeal processes must be fair, proportionate and time-honoured and bound to ensure timely resolutions that provide certainty for both landlords and tenants. An open-ended system with no cost to tenants may inadvertently encourage speculation, appeals planning process, and that would be strained within the adjudication of the bodies. When we look at 139 and 140, rent setting is inherently subjective and the founding markets and reflects the tenants are willing to pay. Therefore, rent determination by rent officers or tribunals should be allowed the seasonal variation. When we look at 496 and 499, the reporting standard establishes it clear that enforcement baseline for property conditions, it isn't a criminal offence to let a property that fails to meet the standards, and these amendments are not only unnecessary but would also introduce subjectively to the well-defined framework. And looking at 238 and 240, existing costs for dealing with appeals already are seen as a deterrent against a misuse by landlords. Penalties will only have a negative impact on supply as small landlords and discourage them from the sector itself. Thank you, Convener. I'm happy to propose these on behalf of Rachel. Thank you.
Alexander Stewart to move Amendment
218.
218.
So moved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 565 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 565 in my name exempts MMR properties from the rent increase frequency proposals. Now, I appreciate that the Government have a consultation on exemptions. This is more an administrative exemption than so much a policy one. This is to smooth out the administration procedures for RSLs and their subsidiaries. As it stands in the bill as introduced, as rent increase notice would be tied to a 12-month cycle counting from the date tenants started a lease. Now, for some medium to larger sized RSLs, that would mean having to issue hundreds of updates throughout the course of the year, depending on the start date of their sitting tenants. Now, I hope that the Government can give me some assurances on the exemption consultation that this is an administrative issue that can be picked up and smoothed so that there isn't such a burden on mid-market rent properties and delivery, and that they would be able to issue a single rent notice to all of their tenants on one particular day of the year, at which point was decided between them and their tenants, normally the 1st of April. But looking forward to hear the Government's response to this and how potentially to tackle this through the exemption consultation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Emma Roddick, to speak to Amendment 138 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. These amendments seek to rebalance the skewed nature of where power lies in a tenant and landlord relationship. 138 seeks to extend the time that a tenant living in a designated rent control area has to refer a rent increase to a rent officer from 21 to 42 days. 21 days is not long enough, and the Government has already recognised rightly that there is work to be done on increasing awareness of rights within tenants in the private rented sector. So when you factor in time to read and understand the notice, seek assistance and get advice, 21 days is very short. 138 and 140 provide meaningful penalties for landlords in a rent control area who ignore the requirements and limits set out by that area. 139 sets the compensation payment that a landlord must pay to a tenant at 3 times the amount by which the proposed increase exceeds the permitted increase, and 140 obliges the rent officer to order that to be paid. To me, that's a just penalty, as the amount will be linked directly to how much more than the legal limit the landlord has attempted to charge their tenant. Thank you.
Thank you. And Maggie Chapman, to speak to Amendment 161 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. One of my hopes for this bill is that we significantly raise tenants' awareness of their rights. As Emma Roddick has already alluded to, that there is a lot of opacity and people are not sure where they stand. Too often, renters don't know their rights. They don't know where to get the information, the right information, and they don't know how to challenge landlords who contravene those rights. Under the bill as drafted, tenants would have a mere 21 days to challenge a rent increase. If they did not act within those 3 weeks, an illegal increase then becomes unchallengeable. That cannot be right. So this creates a situation in which thousands of tenants, perhaps, who have busy lives, might have not had time to research their rights, not be aware of their rights. And if they don't make a challenge in those 3 weeks, they're going to be ripped off by landlords, all with the stamp of approval by the Scottish Government and this bill. So I hardly need to say that I don't think that is acceptable. Until we get to a position when tenants know their rights and are fully supported, we do need to offer some flexibility. My amendments 161, 162, 201 and 202 do this by increasing that limit from 3 weeks to 1 year. I've not simply invented this figure. It comes directly from the Social Security Scotland Act and allows those with good reason not to have challenged it earlier to challenge a decision on their payment for up to a year. So there is congruence with other legislation that this Parliament has passed. The other set of amendments in this group address a concern raised by living rent. At the moment, renters challenging rent can end up with the rent officer raising the rent beyond that which is being asked by the landlord. This acts as a serious disincentive to challenging an unreasonable rent notice and might explain why there are so few challenges to Rent Service Scotland. So my amendments 497, 498 and 499 resolve this anomaly and offer discretion to the rent officer to take into account quality, energy efficiency and other relevant standards when considering a rent challenge. 238, 239 and 240 introduce a £10,000 fine where the landlord has levied an increase beyond that which is allowed under rent control provisions. This is absolutely crucial. Set at £1,000 as it currently is, landlords may take a calculated risk that they can raise rents more than allowed. The amount gained may be more than that £1,000. £10,000 would offer a genuine disincentive. We cannot allow landlords to chance their arm or just write off those fines as simply a cost of doing business. Turning to amendments from colleagues in this group, amendments 139 and 140 from Emma Roddick are also trying to create a financial incentive through the fine system for landlords not to challenge illegal increases. The fines are less strong, but I support the principle of what Ms Roddick is trying to do with her amendments. Amendments 339 and 400 from the Government lengthen the timescale to challenge rent increase in non-rent control areas. This is welcome, but a 9-day increase is minimal and not sufficient. And I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to consider bringing back a much stronger version at stage 3. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Minister, to speak to Amendments 399 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Like the members who have brought forward amendments in this group, we are determined to bring forward a system of rent control that supports the stabilisation of rents for tenants, whilst ensuring there is a balanced approach that provides appropriate protection for the property rights of landlords and supports investment in the development of rented homes. While I think that some of the amendments don't quite strike the balance needed, I absolutely recognise the importance of the issues raised, and particularly the issues raised by Maggie Chapman and Emma Roddick around the need for tenants to understand and also be able to enact their rights, should they wish to do so. In particular, the importance of allowing sufficient time for tenants to challenge a rent increase that they feel is not in line with the rules as Emma Roddick has set out. That is why we've brought forward Government Amendments 399 and 400 in the name of Paul McClellan, which will affect tenants in properties which are not covered by rent control. These amendments would increase the period during which a tenant in a non-rent control area or in an exempt property can refer a proposed increase to the rent officer from 21 to 30 days. These amendments are designed to assist tenants to make use of their rights to challenge a rent increase that they see as excessive. I consider extending the window to 30 days proportionate means of achieving this. But looking now at the amendments lodged by members, Amendments 138...
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I've been listening very carefully, as I always do, to the arguments put forward already by Emma Roddick and Maggie Chapman. I was struck by Emma Roddick is suggesting increasing the period in which a tenant can appeal a rent increase from 21 days to 42 days. And the Minister is suggesting going from 21 to 30 days. And I'm just thinking, if somebody was, for example, on holiday, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, that would eat up the 21 days and wouldn't give them much time to do anything, even within the Minister's 30 days. So I wonder if the Minister could reflect on that, perhaps, ahead of stage 3, and accept what the other members are attempting to achieve here.
I am just about to reflect imminently, Mr Simpson, just on this exact point, if I may, because I do think Emma Roddick has set out a very strong point on this, and indeed Maggie Chapman as well. Amendment 138 in the name of Emma Roddick and 161, 162, 201 and 202 in the name of Maggie Chapman would extend the periods within which a tenant can challenge a rent increase notice. Amendment 138 would give the tenant up to 42 days to notify the landlord that they intend to refer a rent increase to the rent officer, and 161 and 162 would give the tenant up to 1 year to notify the landlord of an intended referral to the rent officer or tribunal. 201 and 202 would give the tenant another year to make a referral. The tenant would therefore have up to 2 years if some of these amendments were passed to challenge a rent increase notice. And this, I do believe, would leave landlords and tenants facing a long period of uncertainty regarding the rent applied. Whilst I agree with the principle that tenants should have sufficient time to challenge an increase, extending the period beyond the current combined period of 63 days could create significant uncertainty for landlords and tenants. However, I do recognise the concerns that members have raised, and I do accept that perhaps we have not quite got that balance correct yet, as Emma Roddick has set out. So I would be happy to discuss with members what might be necessary to ensure that tenants have enough time to challenge the increase, but in a way that does not create undue uncertainty for tenants and landlords. On the basis of the willingness of the Government to work through that process with Ms Roddick and Ms Chapman, I would ask them not to press their amendments. Rachel Hamilton's amendments 218, 219 and 228 would make changes to the provisions that regulate the frequency by which rent may be increased for a property in a rent control area. where a property in a rent control area is not a previously let property, that property is not subject to the rent cap at the start of the tenancy. For those tenancies, the landlord is prevented from increasing the rent in the first 12 months. There is a power in the bill for ministers to prescribe circumstances in which increases in the first 12 months would be permitted. Amendments 218, 219 and 228 would expand this power to prescribe circumstances where the landlord could increase the rent more frequently than once per year. The power provides that this could include circumstances considered to be an emergency. Now, this could result in some tenants in a rent control area being subjected to more frequent rent increases than other tenants, and I consider that allowing more frequent rent increases would undermine the intention of the rent control measures in the bill, and I would therefore urge Rachel Hamilton, or indeed Alexander Stewart on her behalf, not to press these amendments. If pressed, I would urge members not to support. Amendment 565, in the name of Mark Griffin, would disapply the rules on rent control for any tenancy where the landlord was a registered social landlord, a subsidiary of the registered social landlord, or any one of 3 named corporate bodies. Now, I very much recognise that the intention here is to exempt mid-market rents, which we have spoken about in previous groups, convener. And whilst I acknowledge the need to protect the delivery of these tenancies, I do consider that this is best done through the consultation that we have discussed in committee before. For that reason, I can't support Mr Griffin's amendment, but I do hope indeed and would encourage the providers of mid-market rent to make this exact point within the consultation, because I think the points that Mr Griffin have raised is something that requires further airing during the consultation process.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Can I clarify with the Cabinet Secretary this morning that the outreach in terms of reaching out to people who will be impacted by the consultation is still ongoing, and the Government is actively engaging with all stakeholders to make sure that they do respond to the consultation and they are aware of it?
Absolutely. I think one of the key areas that we've looked at, that we've discussed, is in 2 particular points: mid-market rent and build-to-rent. And those are areas of key focus, but also for other stakeholders in this, most particularly tenants and their representatives too. But I can absolutely assure the member that that work is ongoing to encourage exactly those points to be made. Amendment 220, in the name of Rachel Hamilton, would require that rent increase notices for private residential tenancies in rent control areas should set out the reasons for the proposed rent increase. It is not clear what benefit this would provide for tenants. Under the 2016 Act, a tenant with a private residential tenancy can refer a proposed rent increase to a rent officer for adjudication, and the rent officer will determine the rent with reference to the factors set out in the relevant sections of the Act. These factors do not include considerations of the reason for the rent increase. I am of the view that requiring all landlords of private residential tenancies to provide this information to tenants when increasing the rent would be unnecessary intrusion into the landlord's privacy, with no obvious benefit to tenant, and clearly an increase in the bureaucracy and requirements on private landlords. In addition, this would come for significant resource implications in relation to the administration of such information. I would therefore urge members not to press. Amendments 494 to 496, in the name of Maggie Chapman, would seek to introduce an adjudication process which includes consideration of market rents and property quality when a tenant in a rent control area challenges an increase. Currently, rent increases in rent control areas will be limited in line with the cap, and the referral to the rent officer is to confirm that this is the case. Ms Chapman's amendments 497 to 499 are similar to amendments 494 to 496, but would apply in cases where a landlord or a tenant requests a review of a rent officer's determination of a proposed increase. These amendments effectively seek to override the rent cap and instead create a subjective process that goes beyond both the rent cap and the current process of applying open market rent for properties out with rent controls areas. I am clear that the current proposals are the correct approach and provide clarity to both investors, landlords, and I therefore can't support these amendments.
Thank you for taking the intervention. Just a quick question. One of the concerns, though, is that the rent that is adjudicated could be higher than that being asked, and surely that can't be what the government is intending. And I wonder whether there's an opportunity for us to whether there is something, whether the Cabinet Secretary is intending that, or whether there's room for something else to come through.
Well, I'm happy to carry on these conversations with Maggie Chapman in the run-up to stage 3 if she thinks that there is a flaw in what is being suggested by the government at stage 2, or indeed a gap in proposals that would be that would create problems for the tenants. I think what I've tried to set out is that we do believe that it's important that there is a process in place that is based on the rent cap and doesn't have a subjective process attached to that. But if there's further discussions within that caveat that I've made that we can have ahead of stage 3, then I'd be happy to carry those on. But the government's been very clear about the importance of the rent cap on providing clarity to landlords and to tenants, but happy to carry on those conversations if the member would wish to do so. Amendment 139 in the name of Emma Roddick and 238 in the name of Maggie Chapman would require a rent officer to impose a financial penalty on a landlord, requiring them to pay a sum to the tenant if the rent officer finds that a rent increase notice referred to them for verification proposes an increase above the level of the rent cap. The amendments would provide for different financial penalties, either 3 times the amount that was requested by the landlord above the rent cap, or an amount of £10,000. Amendment 140 in the name of Emma Roddick and 239 in the name of Maggie Chapman are similar. These amendments relate to cases where a landlord or tenant refers a rent officer's determination under Section 43M of the 2016 Act for review, and the rent officer finds that proposed rent is above the level of the cap. In these circumstances, the rent officer would be obliged to issue an order for the landlord to pay a penalty to the tenant. These amendments provide for different financial penalties, either 3 times the amount or an amount up to £10,000. But these amendments do not include a defence of reasonable excuse for a landlord, which may have included a genuine error. There is also no right of appeal to an independent impartial tribunal, and there is no discretion for the rent officer to not impose a penalty where they consider a penalty is not appropriate. In addition, Rent Service Scotland is a non-judicial body, and rent officers are arguably not equipped to make a judgment on the culpability of a landlord or the appropriate level of penalty. As such, there would likely require to be a further level of consideration, potentially by the first-tier tribunal, which would create a far more complex and costly process than is set out in the amendment. Whilst I have concerns about the details of the amendments that are proposed, which mean I cannot support them, I do understand the concerns that they are seeking to address, and I therefore would urge Emma Roddick and Maggie Chapman not to press the amendments, but instead I would offer to work with them, similar to my offer in relation to Amendments 137 and 237 debated in an earlier grouping, and would happy to discuss these issues further ahead of stage 3 with a view to reaching an agreement on what might be appropriate, and I hope that would address the concerns that they have quite rightly raised in committee today. Finally, Amendment 240 in the name of Maggie Chapman would require the first-tier tribunal to impose a financial penalty on a landlord, ordering them to pay a sum to the tenant if the tribunal finds that the initial rent under the tenancy was set too high or the first rent increase was too early. The penalty would be up to £10,000. Again, there is no defence of reasonable excuse for a landlord who may have made a genuine error, and there is no discretion for the tribunal not to impose a penalty where they consider that the penalty is not appropriate. For those reasons, I can't support the amendment and would urge Ms Chapman not to press. So I would urge Emma Roddick, Rachel Hamilton and Maggie Chapman not to press their amendments in this group, and instead to work with me ahead in stage 3 to consider if we can find consensus around possible changes to penalties on landlords who do not comply with their duties under this part of the bill. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Would any other members wish to speak? No. Alexander Stewart to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 218.
Thank you, Convener. I've listened to the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm sure Rachel will reflect on those, but I would still like to press 218.
The question is that Amendment 218 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 218? And all those against? The result of the division on Amendment 218 is 3 for and 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. Call Amendment 219 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with Amendment 218. Alexander Stewart, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 219 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There'll be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 219? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 219 is 3 for and 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 35 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Megan Gallagher, on behalf of Willie Rennie, to move or not move? Not moved. Thank you. We're now going to move on to a new grouping, which is the repairs and standards grouping. And I call Amendment 257 in the name of Maggie Chapman, group with amendments as shown in the grouping. Maggie Chapman to move Amendment 257 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I move Amendment 257 in my name. I'll focus my comments this morning on my amendments in this group. I know that there are others that my colleague Ariane Burgess will speak to, but my amendments in this group are designed to focus on quality and efficiency of properties. Many landlords in the private sector provide high-quality homes. We know that, but many do not, and improvement across the board definitely is needed. At least 55% of homes in the private sector have wall insulation. This compares to 69% in the social sector. That's why almost 70% of social homes have an EPC rating of C or higher, almost 20% higher than in the private sector. Levels of disrepair to critical elements are the highest in the private sector than in any other. And in terms of overall quality, in 2023, 40% of private sector dwellings failed the Scottish Housing Quality Standard. 40% of private sector dwellings, compared to just 30% in the social sector. Yes.
And for giving way, does Maggie agree that the EPC system itself is completely out of date? It should have been reviewed long before now. And in certain circumstances, particularly in relation to rural homes, it's actually really difficult for landlords in the private rented sector to get those homes up to standard, given the current EPC system. And what we need to see is that review come forward as quickly as possible in order to have this new EPC system that's going to give landlords, social, private rented sector or otherwise, more opportunities to decarbonise their homes, but have those options so they can choose how's best to do that for their tenants.
I thank Megan Gallagher for that intervention. And yes, absolutely, the EPC system is out of date, and the review is urgently needed. And that's why in my amendments we haven't referred to EPC, because we're anticipating that it will change. So the new, hopefully not too long to wait for energy efficiency rating system will be what these amendments should cover, because, as you say, EPC doesn't take into account the full range of technological advances that we've had in the last few years. So we have a situation where the private sector has about twice the proportion of properties failing on 3 or more criteria compared to social housing. That's the Scottish Housing Quality Standard criteria. So my Amendment 257 and its partner amendments in an earlier group that we've previously debated would act as a very powerful incentive to drive up quality, along with Ariane Burgess's amendments to allow tenants to withhold rent where repairs have not been done, and for local authorities to inspect accommodation and levy fines on landlords who are not looking after their properties and therefore their tenants. We can put significant upwards pressure on standards. This is a complex area, and there are a great deal of amendments in this group. Bearing both of those points in mind, I have left how exactly we do this open. I've not defined that specifically. So it would be for ministers to decide how the minimum standards would be defined. I would encourage members to vote through almost all of the amendments in this group, as they are all trying to do basically the same thing. Emma Roddick's amendment for landlords to financially compensate tenants where minimum standards have been contravened is helpful, as is Daniel Johnson's amendment for poor quality properties to be bought out by local authorities. I'm glad that the Scottish Government is bringing forward AWAB's law to ensure that repair issues are addressed, and I support Conservative amendments which apply this to the private sectors. But with respect to the Cabinet Secretary, there is no need to wait to consult the private sector, as the Government has said it intends to do. In its essentials, a mechanism for a property to be inspected and repairs orders must surely be basically the same, regardless of the sector. Some of these amendments might perhaps overlap and conflict slightly, but that can be resolved. And talking of incentives, that would be a strong incentive for us to work together before stage 3 across the board on this, to work together to develop a plan to ensure that standards in the private sector are the best they can be, not with the 40% failure rate that we currently have. The only amendment the Greens can't support in this group just now is Daniel Johnson's 490. This is a well-intentioned attempt to improve access to the common areas of a tenement or similar building in order for utilities and other works to be done. But I can't support the amendment as drafted, as it would put a burden on tenants to stay at home, perhaps missing work, having to take annual leave, to do what is essentially the landlord's job. However, I would encourage Daniel Johnson to bring this back at stage 3 with some minor tweaks to it to address those concerns. I'll leave my comments there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call myself to speak to Amendments 442 and other amendments in the group. 442 is relating to a lettable standard. Currently in Scotland, we have several different regulations for different types of rented housing. 2 sets of standards apply to privately let homes and 2 apply to social housing. And this system makes it harder for tenants who are unfamiliar with jargon to know their rights. It creates confusion in the landlord sector about what rules need to be followed, and ultimately it creates an unnecessary dogleg in standards, leaving private tenants facing poorer standards than those in social homes. My proposal, which has been backed both by living rent and generation rent, will make everything simpler and will ensure all tenants in all forms of rented accommodation will be treated equally. Instead of 4 separate regulations, all types of rented accommodation will have to meet just one. And ministers will have to consult on exactly what this standard should look like, and I've been careful to ensure that equal weighting in this consultation will be shared between tenants and landlords. I've also included a clause to ensure that the new overarching standard does not allow any regression from what we have at present, so that quality will be maintained in the social sector and improved in the private sector. Amendment 385 is related to withholding rent. Scotland has a severe quality problem with its private housing stock. And some private landlords and their agencies seem to think it's okay to take their tenants' rent without keeping their properties to a habitable, good quality standard. Serious issues like damp and mould, holes in floors and walls, and broken furnishings are left to fester, despite those who rent out homes having a legal obligation to ensure that their housing meets the existing tolerable and repairing standards. In any other sector, if a customer received substandard services like this, there would be a major uproar. So why should the private rental market be treated any differently? And while I know that not all landlords act in this way, if you have the misfortune of being the tenant of a landlord who does act in bad faith, it is a miserable experience, one which could have a significant impact on your health and well-being, social life and work life. People in this situation need more legal protections. The status quo puts the onus on tenants to go to the tribunal in order to get the issue fixed, all the while they have to live with the problem in their home for what could be months or even years, and are expected to pay their rent on time and in full each month. In any other walk of life, a situation like this would be unacceptable. If your train gets delayed, the situation is resolved with a delay repay in just one click. If you buy something faulty from a shop, you're entitled to a refund. If a business receives a substandard service, they withhold money from the supplier there and then. Why should it be any different from renters, especially when housing is a human right? The message we need to send to landlords, particularly those who seek to abuse the system, is that they have to provide good quality housing if their tenants are to pay for it. Amendment 385, which is backed by Living Rent and Consumer Scotland, would give tenants the right to withhold rent if their landlord hasn't fixed serious issues within 30 days of them being raised. And this would create a fairer situation than we would get from Amendment 249 and 444, which don't set an adequate time frame, meaning tenants could face months of distress before their homes are put right. My amendment guarantees that major repairs are sorted out in a timely manner and discourage bad actors in the sector from not fulfilling their legal obligations. Where a landlord believes that they have done enough to resolve the issue, they will be able to go through the tribunal process to unlock the withheld rent. And this way, the burden of having to go through the tribunal process will be shared more evenly across the board between landlord and tenant. Good landlords will be encouraged to keep up their good work, while those who have no interest in their tenants' welfare or the reputation of their sector will find it hard to remain in business. Amendment 489 is related to damp and mould inspections. Everyone in this committee will be aware that there is a major damp and mould crisis in Scotland. And I know my office isn't alone in receiving harrowing stories of renters living in homes where the walls are black with mould, carpets are riddled with spores, and they can't escape the putrid smell of damp. As well as being horrible to live with, mould is a slow, silent killer. Perhaps this is why it hasn't received the same attention as other issues such as the cladding crisis, but it's something that urgently needs to be addressed. By taking action, we can improve the lives of people across our country and take some of the strain off our overloaded health services. Amendment 489 would help to tackle Scotland's damp and mould epidemic, where a tenant has raised their damp and mould issues with the Housing Tribunal. The Tribunal has the power to commission an independent, competent expert to inspect the accommodation. This would mean that the Tribunal and all parties involved can get a fair, impartial view of what's causing the damp and mould and what can be done to fix it. To make sure landlords, tenants and the Tribunal are getting good advice, I've included a provision that will allow ministers to set out what a competent person would be in this context. Moving forwards, I would like this to lead to a situation where we have enough damp and mould expertise in the housing sector to ensure that both tenants and landlords can keep their properties free of this blight. Amendments 538 and 539 relate to inspections for local authorities. And while I recognise that local authorities do have these powers, for some reason inspections aren't taking place. There are too many privately rented homes in Scotland that do not meet required standards, and while the majority of landlords work hard to ensure that their tenants are in well-maintained homes, they are being let down by a small minority of people who own a large number of properties, but view their portfolio as piggy banks instead of what they are, homes. This small number of landlords have been able to get away with it because the existing overburdened regulatory system cannot cope with the sheer scale of wrongdoing. And I believe the legislation we work on in Parliament should always have a reasonable balance of carrot and stick. Given the concerning deterioration in standards in the private rented sector, we need to pursue the latter rather than the former. We need to make it crystal clear to all landlords that they have to meet certain standards or run the risk of being hit in the pocket. And that's why I'm proposing that local authorities are given the power to undertake inspections of rented accommodation every 3 years, Amendment 538, and also are able to carry out spot checks where they suspect a registered landlord isn't following to the letter of the law. That's Amendment 539. Where inspections find that housing does not meet basic habitable standards, the landlord faces being hit by a large fine, and I've opted for a £10,000 fine in this instance because it would incentivise rogue landlords to fix problems, instead of running the risk that they will be fined a sum far exceeding the cost of repairs. It's also important to note that this is a power and not an obligation. We on this committee know that local government finances are under immense strain. which has impacted their staffing levels and the services they can deliver. But with such a large fine on the table, I hope that it will incentivise more action on substandard housing. Furthermore, from a tenant's perspective, it provides another logical avenue through which to raise concerns about the quality of their homes, giving them another layer of protection against rogue landlords. Amendments 557 and 558 relate to affirmative SSI amendments in relation to these LA local authority inspections. Amendment 254, farm work accommodation. Every year, thousands of workers from Europe and Asia come to Scotland to work on farms. They do back-breaking work, picking the fruit and vegetables that we see on supermarket shelves, but all too often they are exploited, be that through not being paid properly, exposure to dangerous conditions, or having their movements restricted. And these workers also face being housed in terrible conditions. The Worker Support Centre recently reported that it had received 100 complaints about poor living conditions in 2024. These included issues with overcrowding, damp, black mould, and broken furniture. It's likely that these reports are just the tip of the iceberg, given seasonal workers are often afraid to raise their concerns lest they lose their job, or worse, have their visa revoked. Many are also unaware of the support that's open to them and have a limited grasp of English. It's unacceptable that people who perform such a vital role, putting food on Scotland's tables, are treated like this. And this is why I'm putting forward this amendment. It would require officers to inspect accommodation provided for workers to ensure it meets legal, habitable standards for housing in Scotland. If housing does not stand up to scrutiny, these officers will have the power to order improvements within a certain time frame and will be backed by their local authority. These people can and should have their human rights respected, because without them, crops would rot in our fields and very few people would have access to healthy local food. I call the Minister to speak to Amendment 231 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I thank all members who have lodged these amendments in this group, and indeed for the discussions that I've had with them in the run-up to today, which has informed government's thinking greatly. Can I also apologise in advance for the length of the speaking note, but there are a number of amendments from different people, so if colleagues will bear with me. I'll first turn to Amendment 231 in the name of Paul McClellan, which would enable AWAB's law to be introduced in Scotland, and I'll consider the related amendments lodged by Graham Simpson and Emma Roddick. This Government is committed to delivering AWAB's law in Scotland, and I consider that Amendment 231 in Paul McClellan's name, coupled with the use of powers in existing legislation to make provision for the private sector, will achieve that aim. Amendment 231 in Paul McClellan's name will enable the Government to implement an equivalent to AWAB's law in Scotland in the social rented sector, so that social landlords must deal with issues such as damp and mould in tenants' home in a timely manner. Amendment 231 expands existing powers in the Housing Scotland Act 2001 to give ministers the ability to impose timeframes on social landlords to investigate disrepair and commence those repairs. For context, the AWAB's law in England will have 28 defined hazards, and the UK Government has been taking a phased approach since AWAB's law was introduced in July 2023. We want to ensure that landlords and tenants are clear on their respective rights and duties, and that is why we will take forward further engagement with stakeholders later this year to fully understand the types of repairs which should be included, as well as appropriate timescales for investigating and commencing those repairs. Members' comments today have referred to damp and mould, and rightly so, but there are other hazards that will also be part of that consultation work. As well as placing requirements on social landlords, Scottish ministers are committed to bringing forward equivalent requirements in the private rented sector after further consultation. There are existing powers under which this can be delivered via the repairing standard in the Housing Scotland Act 2006, and that is why no similar amendment is being presented for the private rented sector today. However, I would stress that we are consulting not on the if, but on the how, as per the social rented sector amendments that we will then take forward and the consultation for in. Yes.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I understand the point that she's raising about existing powers, but could we have a little bit more of an explanation as to why those powers haven't been used up until this point? Because I think it's a really important issue that we're discussing just now, of course, damp and mould, but the other hazards that you've referenced as well. And, you know, when would we be likely to see a WABS law both in the social and private sector?
So the consultation will be this calendar year, both for the social and private rented sector. And I think, as I'll come to in my speaking remarks later on in this group, the conversations that colleagues have had with me, and indeed the amendments that are here, I think demonstrate that powers exist in many places, but they are not being used for a number of reasons, and I'm very keen to get to the details of why that's not being used. Now, in this case, I do believe that a change to the primary legislation is required in terms of timescales to ensure that the purpose of for example, the standards requirements that we have are actually being implemented. In others, it might be a non-legislative approach, but in this one, I am certainly convinced that we need to change the legislation to make the changes happen that we all want to see.
The role of interventions.
Yes.
Thank you. I suppose just following up from Megan Gallagher's question, having a failure rate of 40% means that the current system isn't working. And I think that there has to be more than just the one provision in legislation. There has to be an overarching view. So I suppose I'd welcome a little bit more in detail from the Cabinet Secretary on that. But also, we know... I suppose my question is, what is the information you are hoping to get out of the consultation? Because we know what's wrong. We know that homes are not at appropriate levels. We also know what needs to be done to fix them. So what is the consultation seeking to achieve? Why is it necessary? Why can we not just get on it and make the changes we need to make?
Well, I think the issues that have been raised in the consultation that have happened in England absolutely demonstrate why consultation is required. It is an exceptionally complex issue. If we look at just one issue around the timescales, because we want to make sure they're as stringent as possible, but what we don't want to do is set unrealistic timetails that a good landlord genuinely would not be able to fulfil. On the issue of detail, if you'll forgive me, Maggie, I hope that the rest of my speaking note will deal with some of those, and if not, we'll certainly happy to discuss that further with you. So I cannot support the related amendments, however, lodged by Graham Simpson and Emma Roddick. Mr Simpson's Amendment 231A would change Amendment 231 so that the power to make regulations becomes a duty. This would require Scottish ministers to make regulations on every issue in Section 27(3) of the 2001 Act, when it may only be necessary to cover some of those issues. It is also not entirely within the gift of Scottish ministers to make regulations which are subject to the affirmative procedure, as of course those regulations first have to be approved by Parliament. So there is a technical point on this change as well. Mr Simpson's Amendment 231B is already catered for by Amendment 231, which enables provisions to be made in connection with the right of a tenant to have qualifying repairs carried out, including provision that may require the inspection and approval of any repairs to address issues related to damp or mould. However, in my conversations that I've had with Mr Simpson, which I would thank him for, I do appreciate that he remains concerned that there's a gap still remaining in the government's amendments. I still am convinced that it is not, but I do believe that there's room for discussion there, because both he and I are very much on the same page of wanting to make sure this is a robust system as possible. So I'm happy to work with him in the run-up to Stage 3 if indeed I cannot convince him that no change is required. Amendment 443 in the name of Graham Simpson We would oblige Scottish ministers to lay draft regulations under Section 27 of the 2001 Act within 6 months of Amendment 231 coming into force. This would remove Scottish ministers' discretion, thereby restricting our ability to consult meaningfully with stakeholders and engage with the UK Government. I do believe there is a great danger of making poor regulations as a result of a lack of meaningful and robust consultation process. Amendments 444 and 446, in the name of Graham Simpson, would oblige Scottish ministers to make regulations to ensure private landlords are under equivalent repairing obligations as social landlords in relation to damp or mould. And Emma Roddick's Amendment 444A would require these regulations to include a process whereby a private landlord must make a compensatory payment for tenants where they have failed to meet their repairing obligations. Amendments 444, 444A and 446 are not necessary, as there are already powers in the Housing Scotland Act 1987 and the 2006 Act which enable existing private sector standards to be modified to introduce AWAB's law. The repairing standard can already be enforced via a rent relief order which compensates a tenant with a rent reduction where the house fails the repairing standards. Amendments 231A, 443...
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I go back to an earlier point. If her argument is that we already have existing laws which would tackle the issue in the private sector, well, they're not being used. So there is an issue there. And if she accepts there's an issue, then we need to do something about it. And I think that this is an opportunity to do something about it, to send a message in law, in legislation, which is what we're here to do, that this kind of behaviour is unacceptable and we're going to deal with it.
Well, I would very much agree with the premise Mr Simpson is making, that something does further need to be done, but that's exactly why the Government's committed to the consultation happening this calendar year to bring forward the details around the hazards and the timescales. So we've had the power in the past, and what we'll come to, I think, is in a myriad of points during this group in particular, is for whatever reason those powers are not being used or not being enforced to adequate standards. But that's exactly why the Government will come forward with, for example, a list of hazards, a list of timescales, as per the work that's been going down in England. So we're not just saying there's a power and we're not doing anything about it. What we're coming forward with is a consultation with further details to ensure that happens. So the amendments 231A, 443, 444, 44A and 446 all seek to remove Scottish ministers' discretion as to how to apply AWAB's law in the social and private sectors. This element of discretion is needed to enable us to consult with stakeholders and engage with the UK Government to ensure that private tenants in Scotland are at least as protected in relation to repairs as those in England and Wales. I'm happy to work with Graham Simpson on this issue to identify any issues he has with the proposals for AWAB's law, but I think we do need to take cognizance of the work that has been happening down in England as they move through this consultation process on the complexity of the work and indeed our obligations on making sure we get this right on behalf of tenants. Amendments 221 and 222 in the name of Mark Griffin look at more general repairs in social and private tenancies. 221 would oblige Scottish ministers via regulations to confer a right on a tenant in a social tenancy to have certain prescribed hazard repaired. Amendment 221 would also amend the social landlord's repairing obligations to provide that they must ensure there are no prescribed hazards within the house. 222 would amend the repairing standards in the 2006 Act to oblige a private landlord to ensure there are no prescribed hazards in the house, either currently or prospectively. 221 and 222 would oblige landlords to ensure there are no prescribed hazards in the property, but the landlord might not be in the position to know. An obligation to remedy defects and hazards once they are known is more achievable. These amendments also cut across the existing rights of social and private tenants to have repairs carried out, thereby creating a confusing regulatory landscape for landlords and tenants. As these issues are already provided for in law, I cannot support those amendments, but would point Mr Griffin again to the work that has been undertaken on Awab's law, both in the social rented and private rented sectors. Turning now to Amendments 257 and 267 in the name of Maggie Chapman, which would provide that rent for private residential tenancies in a rent control area could not be increased unless property meets minimum standards specified by Scottish ministers and regulations. Similarly, Amendment 442 in the name of Ariane Burgess would place a duty on ministers to create a new lettable standard through affirmative regulations that all residential property must meet. While I agree with Ms Chapman and Ms Burgess on the importance of all rented properties complying with appropriate standards, there are already statutory standards and enforcement measures in place for rented properties. The repairing standard already obliges landlords to keep the property to a specified standards, with enforcement mechanisms should they fail to do so. The tolerable standard applies to all houses in a local authority area. The Scottish Housing Quality Standards applies to properties in the social rented sector. There are existing enabling powers that could be used to enhance these standards where required. Certainly.
Thank you for that. My amendment 442 is about a standard that the Minister has just listed the different standards that apply in different places. And what I'm trying to do with my amendment is to actually come up with one coherent standard that would address the social sector and the private rented sector. And I wonder if you would take that into consideration, because I do think it's very confusing, the landscape for housing. And I wonder why we have different standards. And my sense is that that's appeared over time. And here's an opportunity to create that coherence that I think people who rent accommodation need.
Indeed, my very next paragraph was to talk about previously social landlords were required to meet higher standards for the rented properties than the private landlords. The strengthened repairing standards from the 1st of March 2024 has largely aligned the rented sector standards across both sectors. There are now very limited areas where rented sector standards are not fully aligned, and the Scottish Government has an ambition to ensure full alignment of housing standards in the future. Adding a further 2 new housing standards via the amendments 257, 267 and 442 to these existing standards would create considerable confusion for landlords, tenants and local authorities as to which standards the landlord must comply. There are already broad powers to amend these existing standards, and I would consider that using these powers would be a more appropriate way to address any gaps in the regulatory requirements that members consider do still exist. And I would be happy to work with Ms Chapman and Ms Burgess on those areas where they are concerned there remains a gap in standards between the social and private sectors in the run-up to stage 3 to see if there are requirements of changes, although that may not have to be done through this bill, but could be done through regulatory change, as I've already mentioned. Amendments 438, 439, 557 and 558 in the name of Ariane Burgess would create a power for a local authority to inspect a house which is entered into the landlord register and impose a fine of up to £10,000 on the landlord if the house does not comply with the tolerable standard. There are existing enforcement mechanisms for the repairing standard under the 2006 Act and the tolerable standard under the 1987 Act. The First-Tier Tribunal can impose a repairing standard enforcement order under the 2006 Act if a property fails a repairing standard. A local authority can issue a works notice under Section 30 of the 2006 Act if a property is considered to be substandard. This would include properties which fail the tolerable standard. These enforcement mechanisms build in a period where the landlord can remedy the defect in a property, but Ms Burgess's amendments did not afford landlords that period of grace. Furthermore, it is not clear in these amendments whether local authorities are expected to inspect all private rented tenancies in their area or only where they have a suspicion that standards are not being complied with. I would therefore ask Ms Burgess not to press these amendments, as there are existing measures which deal with these issues and existing powers which can be used to strengthen the repairing standard, the tolerable standard and the inspection process.
Make an intervention on that point. I hear everything the Cabinet Secretary says about existing powers, but I wonder, my amendments for local authority powers includes a £10,000 fine to encourage landlords to do the right thing and address the issues that people are faced with in their rented accommodation. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would take into consideration some kind of increased fine of a level of £10,000 to encourage that good behaviour.
The point around enforcement is exceptionally important, as well as I'll come on to. There is no point having rights and obligations if they are not being enforced. I think, as I'll come on to say, I'm very keen to work with a number of members to see what can be done. I think many of the issues to improve can be done on a non-legislative basis, but the conversations I hope we can have over the summer will also be able to point out if there are actually gaps in primary legislation that we do need to come back to, and the enforcement measures around, for example, fines, may be one of those issues which the member feels we do need to come back to in a legislative capacity. Amendment 249 in the name of Daniel Johnson and Amendment 385 in the name of Ariane Burgess would provide that a tenant could withhold rent payments where the landlord failed to meet the repairing standard. Whilst I agree that the landlord should always meet the repairing standard, these issues are already provided for in the law. Section 26(2)(b) of the 2006 Act already enables the first-tier tribunal, where a landlord has failed to comply with a repairing standard enforcement order, to make a rent relief order. A rent relief order is an order reducing the rent by up to 90% for the duration of that order. These amendments that we are discussing today would both place the onus on the tenant to determine whether they can withhold rent, rather than having a judicial assessment of whether rent can be withheld. There is a risk with this approach that the tenant could be left with significant rent arrears to make up if they get their assessment of the repairing standard wrong, and I am greatly concerned about that change. The existing rent relief process in Section 27 of the 2006 Act enables the first-tier tribunal to issue a rent relief order. This mechanism provides reassurance to the tenant that the reduced rent is not paid back at a later date, and they can legitimately pay less rent without any fear of later repercussion. In my view, Amendments 249 and 385, although exceptionally well-intentioned, would not improve the rights of tenants.
Intervention on that. So clearly, again, this is another situation where we have the powers, but the system's not working. So I just want to make a note that this would be something I would appreciate working on over the summer to identify and address why people in rented accommodation don't understand or know how they can take action in this area.
And I'm just about to come on to that as well, Convener. I have highlighted this in a number of areas that there are existing tenants' rights in relation to repairs and enforcement powers. But the amendments today and the discussions that I've had with members do highlight the point that they are only meaningful if tenants and other relevant bodies know how to use those rights, and there are no barriers to using them. And the point you've made, Convener, on this one example, but it is just one of the many examples we've discussed in this group, is an exceptionally important one. So it's important, I think, as long as looking at how the regulatory framework could be improved, for example, through primary legislation or indeed secondary, that we also look at what additional non-legislative support could be put in place. There are a range of options we can explore that have the potential to better enable tenants to exercise their rights. For example, further awareness raising of existing rights and routes of redress, such as third-party reporting. This is where the local authority takes forward an application to the tribunal to enforce necessary repairs on behalf of a tenant. Other practical support and advice is available to help tenants navigate the tribunal process. So I'm therefore very keen to work with stakeholders and members to consider what additional interventions would be feasible and effective to achieve the policy objectives behind many of the amendments in this group that I still do not believe require primary legislative change, but where definitely work is required. And I hope that would allow us to meet the policy objectives behind many of the amendments. Amendment 254, in the name of Ariane Burgess, would provide the Scottish Ministers with the power to delegate to such public body that they consider appropriate the function of providing officers under the Agricultural Wages Scotland Act 1949 with the ability to do certain things, such as ability to inspect workers' accommodation. I recognise the need to ensure that accommodation for agricultural workers is fit for habitation, but I do not agree that this amendment would provide the reassurance being sought. It is unclear whether this amendment actually creates a function that can be delegated, and it is also not clear that wages officers under the 49 Act would have the expertise to enable them to inspect the standard of property, given their main function relates to the wages paid to agricultural workers. In order to better understand the full context of this issue and potential solutions, scoping work has been ongoing. Also, local authorities are currently responsible for enforcement of legal housing standards. And this generally happens on a reactive basis where local authorities are made aware of concerns with condition of property and can then respond. Although local authorities would welcome stronger powers to address poorer agricultural seasonal worker accommodation, this does have challenges for the local authorities through enforcement. The Government is fully committed to further engagement with local authorities and other interested parties, and the development work to understand how this can be addressed is ongoing. I therefore ask the member not to press.
Would the Cabinet Secretary take an intervention on that amendment? So I appreciate hearing that there is scoping work ongoing, and I mean, this amendment was actually brought by my colleague Richard Leonard in the Agriculture and Rural Communities, which is now an Act, and it didn't pass then. These people, these agricultural workers, have very little representation because they're not able to vote. So it's hard to make sure that they have that kind of support, which I spoke to when I was speaking to the amendment. So I would be grateful to get a sense of a timeline and what we're looking at in terms of actually coming to some place where we can actually resolve the issues that these people face, also recognising that they do have poor English. They're often fearful of addressing these issues themselves.
I absolutely recognise the point that you're making, Convener, and would be happy to provide that in writing to yourself and to committee following today's discussions. Amendments 477 and 479 in the name of Paul Sweeney would oblige Scottish ministers to provide a process by which a tenant may request a local authority to buy the house they rent where that house does not comply with housing standards. Although I support the principle behind these amendments that private rented homes should be of good quality, the amendments as proposed could lead to the local authority purchasing a substandard property rather than enforcing housing standards. Now, there is no need for a statutory right for a tenant to request that a local authority exercise existing powers to compulsory purchase a property. Tenants can approach their local authority and make such a request at present. There are also existing enforcement mechanisms for local authorities where a property fails to meet the tolerable standard or repairing standards, and I have already discussed those in relation to the previous amendments in this group. Where a landlord has failed to comply with housing standards, it would be more appropriate for those standards to be enforced than to expect the local authority to purchase the property. Although I appreciate the intention behind the amendments, I consider them unnecessary and would urge the member not to press. But as with previous amendments in this group, I would be very happy to work with Mr Sweeney to see if there is a non-legislative approach which can be taken to achieve his aim of greater connectivity between the use of CPOs and tenants knowing their rights in this area. And I thank him for the conversations that he has had with me on this point. Amendment 489 by Ariane Burgess aims to enable the first-tier tribunal to consult an independent person when considering whether a landlord has complied with certain aspects of the repairing standard. Whilst I understand the reasoning behind this amendment, this is already provided for in law. The first-tier tribunal for Scotland Housing and Property Chamber Procedure Regulations of 2017 already give the tribunal very wide power to obtain expert evidence. In addition, paragraph 2 of Schedule 2 of the 2006 Act enables the tribunal to request and consider a report from a third party. I cannot therefore support this amendment as it is already amply provided for in law. Moving on to Amendments 490 in the name of Daniel Johnson. This would impose an obligation on an owner or occupier of a property in a tenement building to take steps to ensure that utility companies have access to common parts of the tenement for the purpose of maintenance, repair and installation work. Utility companies already have access rights in other legislation, for example the Electricity Act of 1989. Sections 17 and 19 of the Tenements Scotland Act 2004 and secondary legislation made in relation to the 2004 Act already provide the framework for access to areas of tenements for maintenance purposes, including access for gas and heating utility companies to install services. Accordingly, I do not believe this amendment is necessary and would ask Mr Johnson not to press.
I think the amendments in the name of my colleague Daniel Johnson are in a probing nature, but it was to highlight an issue that we are potentially going to see a rollout of superfast broadband across the country and the economic benefits that will come with. There is a real concern that tenants and owner-occupiers and tenements will miss out on that opportunity because there is a grey area in between maintenance and improvements and upgrades, and actually what is covered by the definition of what is a utility, and whether that upgrade to broadband infrastructure that many tenant owners and tenants would really benefit from is potentially being missed out on. And I wonder if the Government have any reflection on whether there is a potential grey area that maybe needs to be looked at.
Well, I think Daniel Johnson raises a very important point, and Mark Griffin has detailed that today around improvements. Certainly, the work I've undertaken to prepare for committee would suggest that we are in a good place on this. But if Daniel Johnson does believe there are remaining concerns, I would be happy to take that away before stage 3, speak to him and indeed speak to the providers in this area to see if those concerns are shared. There is work that's ongoing also with the Scottish Law Commission in considering potential reforms to the law on tenement management schemes in the 2004 Act. That's reporting in spring 2026. That may assist with some of those areas. But again, either if Mr Griffin or Mr Johnson are still concerned about that, we would be happy to come back on that. For the points that you've raised, whether it's superfast broadband or other areas, it is exceptionally important that we do look at those aspects. So I'm happy to take that away to seek further reassurance. On Amendment 516, while I recognise the intent behind this amendment by Megan Gallagher to make all new dwellings safer, I cannot support a proposed amendment which seeks to change subordinate legislation without consultation. The Building Scotland Regulations 2004, which prevent the installation of combustible external wall cladding systems on relevant buildings, was made in 2022 following consultation the previous year. A formal review process would be needed to support a change in the scope of these regulations, and evidence to support such a change would be essential. The safety case for change and the economic and social impacts require to be understood, quantified and consulted upon before an informed decision can be made. Many will be aware that as part of our response to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report, we have committed to a further broad review of standards, and a call for evidence on our current fire safety provisions will be launched this autumn. This will provide an opportunity for issues that have been raised by Ms Gallagher's amendments to be considered and for relevant evidence to be gathered. The call for evidence will support us in identifying and prioritising improvements to our fire safety standards. And I believe this is the correct way of moving forward with the issue that Ms Gallagher has raised in this amendment. Accordingly, I cannot support the amendment today. However, I do hope the consultation that is ongoing will assist in this process.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. The reason behind my amendment, and I'll be able to speak to the amendment itself in due course, it was out of frustration. And the frustration is in relation to the slow pace in which we are beginning to deal with buildings that do have this particular facade on them, but also indeed in relation to the safety and well-being of people who reside in those buildings who are impacted. I'll be able to speak on my amendment in a little while, but I actually wanted to extend the scope of my amendment, although it did fall out with the competency of the bill itself, because I do believe that whilst we're talking about housing in relation to my amendment 516, there's clearly an issue with other buildings that do have cladding, including hotels, hostels, boarding houses, care homes, just to name a few. And I'm asking the Cabinet Secretary today, will that be part of the consultation? And are we going to look at the test standard, which has been declared as not fit for purpose?
If I can perhaps come back to Ms Gallagher in writing around the consultation. I mean, this is clearly a consultation that will be launched this autumn. So I'm happy to reflect on the points that she has raised and get back to her on those once I've had a further opportunity to speak to Mr McClellan, who's leading on this issue, about where the consultation drafting has got to and the scope of that. If she will allow me to come back to her in writing once I've had those discussions, I'll be happy to do so. Amendments 552 and 555 in the name of Jamie Halcrow-Johnson seeks to restrict policy making in any future attempt to regulate heating systems. This Government's approach has long recognised that there may be a need for secondary heating systems, particularly in rural and island communities, and our approach protects the use of direct emissions in secondary heating systems if required. For example, the recent new build heating standard already allows for secondary heating systems of the kind specified by the amendment. It should be very clear that voting against this amendment is not a vote against wood-burning stoves or other secondary heating systems, as this amendment is not needed to protect their use. These amendments are simply unnecessary. My concern with the amendments is that they could tie the hands of future governments, particularly where there remains scope for technological advancement, and I do not think this is appropriate and cannot support the amendment. Yeah.
Taking intervention. Thanks very much. Apologies for me to pop out there quickly. We've seen a situation recently where the government brought in a ban on wood-burning stoves in new build homes, and then recognising the real concerns of communities, particularly those in my region, then immediately kind of reconsidered it and then withdrew that. I mean, surely that suggests that there isn't a clarity on that, and these amendments would provide a bit more clarity.
Well, I do, and I thank Mr Halcrow-Johnson for bringing these amendments forward, because it gives me the opportunity to restate the Government's position on this, as set out in the regulations that have very recently came before Parliament. As I've said in my remarks, the Government absolutely recognises the need for secondary heating in systems, particularly, but not just including in rural island communities, and the reasons for not supporting these amendments is because they are unnecessary. It's not a reflection on any change or diminution of the Government's policy on this area, so I can absolutely reassure him on this point. Convener, amendments 470 to 473 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy would require Scottish Ministers to, in summary, publish an accessible home standard, including building and design standards for new build homes. These amendments would also oblige the Ministers to publish guidance on the design of housing for varying needs. These obligations would require to be met within 2 years of commencement, and regular review would be required thereafter. I understand and fully support Ms Duncan-Glancy's desire to ensure the accessibility and adaptability of Scotland's homes. During the second half of 2023, we consulted on proposals to do just that. Homes have never been simply bricks and mortar. Good housing and homes supporting our health, our well-being and our life chances and our jobs prospects are also integral. Everyone should have a home that brings them those chances and opportunities. Housing to 2040 committed to developing and introducing an all 10-year Scottish accessible home standard, and within Housing to 2040 we also reaffirmed our commitment to review the Housing for Varying Needs Design Guide, which, although well regarded and still considered to be a good design benchmark, was produced in 1998. We recognise the urgency of this work, and we remain committed to introducing these changes, and the analysis of the responses to the consultation on these matters is now being considered, which will help inform our next steps. This means that the inclusion of these amendments would therefore be premature in advance of fully considering the feedback of the many respondents who have submitted their views. I would once again assure Ms Duncan Glancy that while I oppose these amendments, this is not because the Scottish Government are not supportive of the principles behind them, but because we are giving detailed consideration to the consultation feedback at this point. And I can assure Ms Duncan Glancy that this important work will not be delayed, for example, because of our work on the housing emergency, and I look forward to engaging with Ms Duncan Glancy as we continue to progress matters. Moving on to Ms Duncan Glancy's amendments 551 and 561, which would oblige Scottish ministers to provide a scheme for adaptations to housing to improve accessibility. The Housing Scotland Act 2006 already provides a right for private tenants to carry out work to their house in order to make the house suitable for the accommodation, welfare or employment of a disabled person who lives there. As the legislative basis for adaptations provision already exists, these amendments are not necessary and risk creating a confusing regulatory landscape. Furthermore, we plan to undertake a review of the current housing adaptation system, which will make recommendations on how best to improve and streamline the system and better target resources. The scope of the coverage of the Housing Scotland 2006 Act will be part of that, so I do consider that these amendments are not necessary and therefore cannot support them. In closing, Convener, having addressed all of the amendments in this group, I would ask the committee to vote for the Amendment 231 in Paul McClelland's name, and I would ask other members with amendments in this group not to press, and if those amendments are pressed, I would ask the committee to vote not to vote for them for the reasons I've laid out.
Thank you very much. And Graham Simpson to speak to Amendment 231A and other amendments in the group.
Well, thanks very much, Convener. The Cabinet Secretary wasn't kidding when she said she was going to speak for some time, and she did. And I imagine that all those members who've tabled very well-meaning amendments in this group will be slightly disappointed. I counted 31 amendments not in the Minister's name, and the Cabinet Secretary has essentially said she doesn't support any of them, and that I have to say is disappointing. Yes.
Appreciate I've already spoken for a moment. Can I reassure the member I very much support the policy intent behind many of these amendments, but do not think they're required. But there are other ways to achieve that policy intent. So I would like to make that slight caveat to the point you've just made.
Yes, and I heard that very clearly. I will go on to say that I think the tone of the Cabinet Secretary is slightly more positive than we've heard before, during the process of this bill. She is offering to work with people, and I think people might want to consider cancelling any plans they have for the summer, because the Cabinet Secretary has offered to have a good number of discussions. So we may want to be checking our calendars, checking with our other halves to see if that's appropriate, because we're going to be extremely busy. And that goes back to something that I predicted last week, which I suspect is about to come true, that stage 3 will be after the summer. And I think, given what's been said, it's going to have to be, because there are a number of discussions that have to be held. And Maggie Chapman actually made the point, I think it was a very good point, that we ought to be working together ahead of stage 3, as I think we're going to have to do on the various student issues which have been raised before, in order that we get this right. My reflection, and I'll come on to my particular amendments, but my reflection on pretty much all the amendments in this group is that, you know, the intent is well-meaning behind them all. People want to see the quality of accommodation, particularly in the rented sector, be driven up. And we've heard already, and the Cabinet Secretary has repeatedly said, oh, we have, you know, the laws are in place, you know, we already have the powers, and yet she accepts that something is failing, something is not working. So we really need to be working, I think, during the process of this bill to have a system that actually does work. I think if we can all pull together on that, really we've got a lot of work to do here. If I can just go on to my own amendments, and they do deal with AWAB's law, which this committee has already looked at, and I was lucky enough to be sat in a session. Ms Gallagher couldn't make it that week, and I was very lucky enough to stand in on her behalf when this committee looked at AWAB's law. And if I could just remind people again that Awab Ishak died in Rochdale in 2020, and that highlighted the issue of damp and mould in houses. So we have a death of a child that's brought this to the fore, and we've had legislation in England, but not here yet, and we need to get that right. So we're here to protect people, and that's what this is about, and driving up standards. I think, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I thank Graham Simpson for giving way and also for filling in for me the week that I wasn't able to attend committee. He raises an excellent point, you know, that this is, of course, you know, on the back of really tragic circumstances. I'm very keen to hear more about the other hazards that have been identified in relation to what's been brought forward in England and Wales. And does he want to see those hazards being brought into legislation that we're trying to bring forward here to make sure that we're protecting people, not just from damp and mould, but from other hazards as well that could be life-threatening, as we've heard this morning?
Yes, I do, yeah, and I'd be interested to hear what those other hazards are as well. I don't know what they are, but yeah, they'll be listed somewhere. My focus really is on the damp and mould issues, which, as I say, this committee looked at on March the 18th. And we heard then from Sean Clarkin. He was here, Sean of the Scottish Tenants Organisation, and he called for proper statutory intervention that requires accurate information about housing stock, annual inspections and training, so that all employees of private and social landlords can identify damp and mould. And he said, and just to quote Sean, for too long the housing sector has lacked the knowledge and has been totally inadequate in dealing effectively with damp and mould. And I think that was a good point. So I think statutory intervention is required to help protect tenants against the problems of damp and mould. And I think it was yourself, convener, that said earlier that most of us will have had to deal with problems of damp and mould at some point in our parliamentary careers, or if we've been councillors, as I was before. And I was reflecting when you said that, early on in my time as an MSP, I had to deal with a case in Motherwell, and it was quite the worst conditions I've ever seen in a block of flats, riddled with damp and mould, walls absolutely black and nothing being done. It was not fit for habitation, but people were living there. And I don't think the law was adequate then, and if it wasn't adequate then, it's not adequate now. And we need to do something about it, because people should not be living in these conditions in modern-day Scotland. And that, yes.
Thanks for relaying that particular example. I've come across similar examples. And too often, I think, local authorities rely on the claim that the tenants aren't circulating air within the property sufficiently. Do we think we need to provide more evidence as to exactly the source of this mould? Because the dismissal is leaving tenants in properties that are just uninhabitable, in my view.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I'll come on to that because one of my amendments deals with that very issue. The Minister's Amendment 231 changes the list of what should be in regulations under Section 27 of the Housing Scotland Act 2001 from a must to a may. And my Amendment 231A changes that back to a must. And this would mean that everything in section 27.3, including the new terms inserted by Amendment 231, would be required to be included in the regulations. And the Cabinet Secretary said that already. She's made that point. If she wants to work with me ahead of stage 3, of course I'll do that. But we need to have an endpoint. The endpoint must be that we need to have laws, and they're not necessarily... She shouldn't be assuming that just because government drafters have written something that it's perfect, when other members have perfectly good ideas and other people have spotted gaps in what's being put forward by the government. And none of us here are trying to be awkward. We're all just trying to improve people's lives. So 231B, and this will address the issue raised by Mr. Rennie, it's another amendment to 231. That would provide for regulations to include provision on requiring the inspection and approval of repairs to address damp and mould. And I think you, Convener, have got a very similar amendment 489. I think it's very easy, isn't it, if you identify that you've got damp and mould in a property, for somebody just to come in, maybe wipe it down, put on a lick of paint, and say that's it sorted. But you haven't actually sorted it. You've not got to the root of the problem, and then it comes back. So what we need, actually, I think, is some kind of independent assessment and inspection of work, particularly in the worst cases. Maybe not in cases where it's a, let's call it a light infection, but in the worst, very worst cases, you wish to intervene.
Please.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I think this one in particular is an area where I'm very keen to, and I would in no way say that government drafting is perfect. And as Minister, I take responsibility for that. That is for me to sign off. And this issue is one of the areas, this particular amendment is one of the areas where I do think we have the issue covered. But in the discussions that we've had to date, we still have a disagreement about whether it's covered or not. But we do genuinely want to get to the same point. I believe, from the discussions that we've had. So I'd be very happy to work with Mr Simpson on this, because if there are gaps, then I am absolutely determined to close them before stage 3, because there is no point us going through this work and not having as robust a system as possible. So I thank Mr Simpson for bringing this forward to see if we can absolutely test this to the point of breaking, to see whether there's any gaps he can find.
Right. Well, I mean that's very good, and I completely believe the Cabinet Secretary. I think she's serious about this, and if we can move forward in that spirit, then we might get to a point at stage 3 where we're all agreeing on something. And I think that's where we need to be. When I had my discussions with the Cabinet Secretary, which are always really useful, I did mention to her that what sparked my amendments in this particular area was a discussion that I had with an expert at one of the universities, who's an expert in damp and mould, and he is a professor. I'm not going to name him because I've not got permission to name him, but he actually raised the issue of this bill with me, and I was on a completely unrelated visit. And he mentioned it, and he felt there were gaps, and he told me that there is actually a new international standard for mould treatment set by the International Standards Organisation, and that's something the Scottish Government may not be aware of, but I can certainly send them the details, and I will. And if I've got the permission from this academic, I'll put him in contact with the Cabinet Secretary, because having that kind of expertise and looking at legislation like this will help us to get it right. So if we have this international standard now, which we do, for inspection, then it seems to me that, you know, that's what we ought to be aiming for. And we certainly shouldn't be left with the position, as I outlined earlier, where you can just rub a cloth over something and slap some paint on, and that's job done, because it's not job done. Far from it. So 443, this amendment would require the regulations envisaged by the Minister's Amendment 231 to be brought within 6 months following changes to the 2001 Act coming into force. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has already made the point to me that this could potentially clash with the election period. So I take that point on board, so I'll not press that one. 444 would require ministers to make regulations imposing equivalent duties to address damp and mould on private landlords as apply to social landlords, including a requirement to consult. And the equivalent legislation in England will only apply to social landlords, though the UK government has said they'd like to extend the provisions of AWAB's law to the private rented sector. Now, you know, the Cabinet Secretary, well, she said, as I said earlier, she's rejected all the amendments that are not hers. So that includes this one. She's been very mean, I'd have to say, on this in this particular group. But you know, I think again, we can't leave the private sector untouched if we're looking at these issues. So, in the spirit in which I always work, I will work with the Cabinet Secretary ahead of stage 3, but she needs to be clear what the end point is. And it cannot be, well, the rules are there, Mr. Simpson, don't worry about it, because I'm afraid that's not good enough. I will.
Very briefly, to summarise, the Scottish Government is absolutely determined to bring forward AWAB's law in the social rented sector and the private rented sector. The ways of doing it are different because of legislation, but the end point is absolutely the same for both sectors. But again, happy to work with Mr Simpson on that in the run-up to stage 3.
That's good. I'm encouraged to hear that. So my final amendments, 446, would just apply the affirmative procedure to the regulations in Amendment 444. And I shall leave it there, because I've also spoken at some length, but I do feel very strongly about this, and I can see from just looking around that everybody feels strongly about this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, and certainly there is a strength of feeling, and I think we will all be getting our diaries open and getting some dates over the summer so we can work together on this. I now call Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 221 and other amendments in the group, and I also understand that, Mark Griffin, you're going to speak to Daniel Johnson and Pam Duncan and Glancy's amendments.
Yep, that's right. Thank you, Convener, and I hope colleagues will bear with me while I cover the amendments of my own name and two of my colleagues. Amendment 221 replicates AWAB's law for RSLs in Scotland and gives ministers power to create regulations that entitle tenants to have repairs carried out to remedy hazards. And Amendment 222 replicates AWAB's law for private landlords. Now, I'm aware that the Government and I have similar amendments in this area, and I'm also aware that the legislative landscape in Scotland differs from the rest of the UK in terms of the obligations placed on social landlords to deal with potentially unsafe homes. My concern is that the repairs currently required by policy in Scotland should have the force of primary legislation, and that Through regulations, ministers make clear what an acceptable timescale for repairs is. I'm happy to work with the Government to ensure that stringent and enforceable timescales are set out in legislation. That's also the case for my amendment on number 222, where I look to ensure that the obligations placed on the public sector to ensure hazards in homes are repaired quickly are also placed upon landlords in the private sector. That forms part of our commitment to seeing the balance of interest between tenants who deserve to live in warm, safe and affordable homes and their landlords who should be able to guarantee safe homes that don't put tenants and their children in danger of illness in exchange for a fair rent. My priority in tabling this amendment is to ensure that landlords and housing associations define hazards to be fixed in the broadest sense possible and that those hazards are fixed as quickly as possible. Awab's tragic death should never have happened, and while I appreciate organisations like SFHA reassuring me that the more stringent policy regime in Scotland makes it more unlikely, and brought cases as an MSP which have too many similarities to Awab's for me to be entirely comfortable with the status quo. I think we've discussed this many times, and many MSPs have the same constituency casework relating to damp and mould, and that it is an absolutely huge concern for us. Now, from what I've heard from the Cabinet Secretary, I'm satisfied that I think the Government and I, in fact, all members of the committee are in the same place, and I'm happy not to push today's amendments on the understanding and that there will be further discussions between stage 2 and 3. But as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out, I think there's a problem between policy intention and delivery here. And while we are still getting cases of horrific damp and mould in properties, how that is affecting tenants, how that is affecting their children, and the response sometimes to those complaints of often being told it's their own fault is entirely unacceptable. And I think that it's something that I absolutely hope that the Government will make good on their commitment to address, and in that tone, don't plan on moving amendments 221 and 222. Briefly on amendments 249 and 490, in the name of my colleague Daniel Johnson. On 249, that amendment streamlines the process for withholding rent in the event of a failure to serious repairs, including window defects, central heating defects, water ingress and leaks. It provides that if the tribunal has determined that the landlord has failed to comply with the duty to meet the repairing standard, the tenant may withhold rent until remedial works are completed. That applies solely to properties which the repairing standard applies, and therefore not to Scottish secure tenancies. And the amendment also provides that where the tenant has withheld rent under this section, that is not considered as rent arrears for the purposes of the eviction grounds in Schedule 3 of the 2016 Act. I take on board what the Cabinet Secretary has said, and my colleague Daniel Johnson has lodged 249 and 490 as probing amendments to get that debate on the record, and take the assurance from the Cabinet Secretary on that point. On Amendment 490, that the function of that is that an owner or occupier of a property in a tenement building must take steps, including where necessary, notifying other owners and occupiers to ensure that utility companies have access to any common part of the tenement building for the purposes of maintenance, repair or installation work. And it's the installation work which is the key point here, and also a concern that on the definition of utilities, to really push and probe the Government on how telecommunications is covered. Like I said in my intervention to the Cabinet Secretary, we have been approached by BT Openreach, who have got a real concern that those owner-occupiers, those tenants who live in tenemented buildings, are at real risk of missing out on the superfast broadband rollout due to the restriction on access to make those installations in common areas of tenement buildings. Now, I'm reassured by the response from the government that they will look at that more closely and recommend the government start that discussion with BT Openreach to see if there is a way of reassuring them that this would not be a barrier to roll out of superfast broadband, particularly to tenement buildings and buildings who share common areas in Scotland. Yep, certainly.
Thank you, and I appreciate you speaking to another member's amendment in this case, but I just wonder whether he agrees with the concern that I raised when I spoke about tenants having, by this amendment, default responsibility to be in, so people can have access. Surely that should be the landlord's job to make sure that the property is accessible. I just wondered whether he agreed with that concern that we have with this amendment.
Yep. Apologies, Ms Chapman. I meant to cover that point when I was responding. Yeah, absolutely. These are probing amendments. That the purpose of this is to have the debate to make sure that we are not at risk of excluding tenanted buildings and other areas for that superfast broadband rollout. Daniel Johnson has no intention to press this amendment, and it's simply to get that on the record and a recognition from the government that is potentially an area that we need to look at, and so concerns are valid, and if that was to come back at stage 3, I'm sure Mr Johnson would try and address that, but probably would have no intention of bringing them back at stage 3 purely to get this on the record and start that debate and dialogue between government and Openreach. But I appreciate the points that you've raised. Finally, in covering my colleague Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendments, and these are more detailed notes that have helpfully been provided by Ms Duncan-Glancy, that according to Scotland's 2022 census, approximately 24.1% of the population reported having a disability. This percentage reflects a significant increase on previous years and highlights the growing need for inclusive policies and support to ensure disabled people can participate in society and lead an ordinary life. Now, that figure is even higher in Ms Duncan-Glancy's region in Glasgow. In the 2022 census, 26% of Glasgow residents reported having a disability, meaning Glasgow has the highest proportion of disabled people among major Scottish cities. Furthermore, Scotland, like many developed countries, has an ageing population. The number of over 75s is projected to increase by 70% by 2045, from about 460,000 in 2020 to over 780,000. All of that highlights the need to bring forward policies fit for the future, including ensuring that housing is fit for the future. The reality is, though, that a large proportion of Scotland's existing housing stock does not work for people with reduced mobility or care needs. In 2021, over 100,000 people in Scotland were on waiting lists for accessible social housing. Specific figures detailing the number of individuals in Glasgow waiting for accessible social housing are difficult to obtain. However, of the 4 housing associations in Glasgow that have responded to recent FOI, figures show that there are currently 1,395 people on a waiting list for a ground floor property. With over 60 housing associations and housing cooperatives currently operating across Glasgow, that figure will undoubtedly be far higher. And furthermore, it considers that only one type of adaptation. Scotland faces significant challenges in meeting the demand for home adaptations, which are essential to allow disabled people to remain in their own homes. This is a key to maintaining independence, which has a knock-on effect on health and well-being. With the projected changes to Scotland's demographic, it's more important than ever to ensure that people have accessible and adaptable homes available to them, and that's why Ms Duncan-Glancy brought forward this suite of amendments. On Amendment 470, Accessible Home Standard, in its Housing to 2040 document, the Scottish Government committed to introducing the Scottish Accessible Home Standard for all new homes to be implemented through changes to building standards and guidance from 2025-26. However, the Scottish Government has delayed the introduction of the Scottish Accessible Home Standard. In a ministerial statement delivered in late 2024, the Minister announced the legislation to implement the standard would be rescheduled. So instead of introducing the legislation in 2025, the Government plans to launch a public consultation instead. Now, that's particularly concerning given the increase in demand for accessible housing. The Government has indicated that the forthcoming consultation will inform the development of the standard with a phased introduction anticipated between 2025 and 2030. People across the country, particularly disabled people, are fed up of continually being asked to participate in the consultations which don't necessarily result in the action that they want to see. Disabled people and their representative organisations were actively consulted during the development of the Scotland's Housing to 2040, and they now want to see change, but more importantly they're absolutely fed up of being stuck in houses that are inaccessible for them. Amendment 470 compels ministers to create an accessible home standard that all house builders must adhere to when designing and building homes across all tenures. It requires the standards to be introduced no later than 2 years from when the bill comes into force. The purpose of this amendment is to guarantee progress on previous commitments. Because the Government has been slow to act so far, it will help improve the accessibility and adaptability of new build homes to ensure that they are suitable for people of all ages and abilities. Amendment 471 on review of accessible home standard, with Scotland's population set to undergo further demographic shifts in the coming years and the pace of change in technology supporting people to live in their own homes, it's important that the accessible home standards is updated to reflect that. And this follows on from Amendment 470 to ensure that the standard is reviewed and gives scope for it to be updated as building techniques and demand change. It also ensures that disabled people and interested groups would be consulted during the review process and that any updated standard can be scrutinised by the Scottish Parliament. On the existing housing need for varying needs design guide, originally published in 1998, has yet to be formally updated more than 25 years since its introduction. And while a review of Part 1 of the guide, which focuses on the design of self-contained houses and flats, was initiated in 2023, the Government have yet to publish the outcomes of that consultation or formally update the Housing for Varying Needs design guide. Scotland's demographic landscape has undergone significant changes since 1998, and the existing design guide predates those demographic changes. It's also not fully aligned with current accessibility expectations or technological advances. It's inconsistent across tenures and is poorly aligned with modern building standards. So Amendment 472 mandates ministers to publish guidance on the design of housing that is accessible for people with a range of needs within 2 years of the bill's passage. The purpose of the amendment is to bring current guidance up to date and ensure that it reflects the ever-changing needs of Scotland's diverse population. It will clarify what developers should consider when building homes. Amendment 473 follows on from Amendment 472 and ensures that any guidance produced is reviewed as the demographic continues to shift and developments are made to building techniques and resource availability. The purpose is to ensure that the current situation with the existing guidance now over 25 years out of date is then avoided. Amendment 551 requires Scottish ministers to introduce a scheme to provide housing adaptations which improve accessibility, as recommended by the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. The scheme would be tenure neutral and integrate adaptations into planned repair, maintenance and update programmes. It would also include a mechanism for evaluating the adaptations process in the form of future strategy and resource allocation. The purpose of the amendment is to make it easier for people to access and navigate the adaptations process and allow people to remain in their own homes. Now, that covers all the amendments in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, but Ms Duncan-Glancy is appreciative of the discussions she's heard with the Cabinet Secretary and the assurances from Government to work on these issues in advance of Stage 3 and doesn't plan to press the amendments in the group, but did want to put them on record and the issues currently faced by disabled people in accessing homes that meet their needs. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mark. And I now call Emma Roddick to speak to Amendment 444A and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, my amendment in this group is a simple amendment to Graham Simpson's, which is one that I was glad to see. Should his pass, I believe that there needs to be a compensatory payment available. So my amendment requires that future regulations that the government is bringing in should provide a process for those compensatory payments to be made. I agree with Graham Simpson on his comments in the debate. I think that situations where tenants are left with serious repair issues that haven't been seen to very often suffer from extra hidden costs, as well as having to continue to pay their rent despite the substandard state of the property that they're renting. That doesn't just create understandable resentment on the part of the tenant, but it can also be a factor in them feeling that they have to move somewhere else. Even if that place is not more expensive, moving costs are significant, and in the worst cases, living with these repairs that need to be made can damage health and well-being, future work capacity, and pose a risk to life. Absolutely.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I'm not planning to press Amendment 444, given the Cabinet Secretary's positive comments about working ahead of Stage 3. And Emma Roddick will have heard what I think should happen is that, you know, a group of MSPs should be getting together to explore these issues. Is that something she'd be interested in taking part in?
Yeah, absolutely. The member has guessed what my next comments are going to be. Overall, I think there does need to be work done here, and I'm happy to have those conversations with the Cabinet Secretary alongside Graham Simpson and other members. I agree that we should be working together, and it does seem that there's rare and strong consensus here today on this issue. Mark Griffin was also right. I've got the same casework that he describes, and apart from the fact that the cause is often nothing to do with what the tenant's up to, there's no explaining to tenants who can't afford to pay their heating bills that the landlord expects them to keep their windows open more. I think the issues raised by Ariane Burgess and Daniel Johnson's amendments also deserve attention. Tenants should have a right to withhold rent in cases that serious repairs are not being seen to, and landlords don't have a justification for raising their rent while that is the state of the property. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll call Paul Sweeney to speak to Amendment 477 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener, and thanks to colleagues who have spoken so eloquently about their respective amendments so far. I'm primarily here to speak to Amendment 477. The intention behind it, as was alluded to by the Minister, is to address long-term dilapidations in privately let property. The synopsis behind this amendment is that if a property in private let is deemed to be substandard by failing to meet the repairing standard or the tolerable standard for a period of longer than 12 months, then the tenant would have a right in statute to apply to the local authority to initiate a compulsory purchase order process or an escalation to a compulsory purchase order for the property, and therefore to transfer it to an appropriate local registered social landlord, whether that be the local authority itself or a third-party housing association. This procedure could be underwritten by the Scottish Government with the costs of the purchase recovered over a reasonable period, for example 25 years from the receiving social landlord taking ownership of the property. And this would have the effect of making the policy effectively cost neutral for the Government. It would allow for established best practice already underway in Glasgow in using compulsory purchase orders to take over long-term vacant housing stock to be expanded to housing stock that's in generally poor condition, although habitable, in areas like Govan Hill, to be accelerated and scaled up. And to turn to the case study in Glasgow, the city has been at the forefront of using compulsory purchase orders to tackle problems of long-term vacant properties, increasing affordable housing supply and ensuring the upkeep of pre-1919 tenements, of which there's around 70,000 in the city with an estimated repair backlog of £3 billion. The CPO process has been a way of responding to the blight caused by derelict abandoned flats and homes that have been left vacant for a variety of different reasons, or properties which have previously been let out but are now below the tolerable standard. The promotion of compulsory purchase orders by Glasgow has sent a message that the local authority is active in taking steps against private landlords or other individuals who fail to address problems with their properties. And whilst this is a last resort measure, 52 homes across Glasgow have been pursued for compulsory purchases since 2019, of which 34 have been concluded. In the other cases, 13 owners opted to sell voluntarily to housing associations, and a further 2 properties have been sold or occupied by family members, meaning that the planned CPOs weren't continued. In all cases to date where the CPOs have been confirmed, once Glasgow City Council has invested in the property, it has entered into a back-to-back agreement with a local community-based housing association, which carries out the necessary repair works to bring it up to a tolerable standard and then back into active use to provide affordable housing for those who need it, which is particularly acute given the housing emergency in the city. Some of the properties targeted have been lying empty for more than 14 years, while other properties have been designated as below the tolerable standard for more than 5 years. All of these empty properties, because they're generally tenemental stock, create environmental blight affecting neighbours and the wider community. Benefit derived from bringing these and other homes back into use is significant, particularly for those tenants and owners who live in close proximity and have suffered as a direct consequence of abandonment. There is, however, a limit on how much any local authority can achieve through compulsory purchase orders alone, given budgetary constraints, and of course the steps in making and obtaining compulsory purchase orders are complex, time-consuming, costly and also resource-intensive. They're also dependent on establishing a partnership with a housing association in Glasgow's case, because the city doesn't itself manage social housing, and they have to be willing to take on the property after the council purchases it. So without that, there is a risk that the council would be paying money to acquire assets that would then cost further sums to repair and still be left on the council balance sheet. So even with back-to-back purchases, the cost and resource of seeing CPO cases through to confirmation limits the number of CPOs that the council can promote. And of course, the council has indicated that its preference would be to expand this to compulsory sales orders, which I know the government has been considering. The officers of Glasgow City Council consider that that could address up to half of the long-term empty homes in Glasgow. But of course, that isn't on the horizon. I don't believe the government has published timescales. So I think there is a potential remedy to actually create a proper demand signal and a system of escalation in statute. Yes, happy to give way.
Can I thank the member for giving way, and thank him for the really interesting conversations we had on this, to reassure him that there is consultation of CPOs that will be coming forward in September of this year, I understand, but I'll get back to the member on the timings of that if I've not quite remembered that correctly. He does raise a really interesting point about how this can go further, though, whether it's compulsory sales orders or indeed compulsory leasing orders, which have been discussed in other areas too when we're looking at tackling the housing emergency, all of which are of interest to the government. So I would very much agree with him that although Glasgow has been at the forefront of using CPOs, and indeed there's a lot of local authorities that can learn from what they have been doing, there is clearly more that we can do in this area. So really keen to work with them on some of the points that we've raised on this discussion. Again, I'm not sure it requires legislation, but the points that he makes about the best use of the current housing stock, and particularly bringing housing stock up, I think were exceptionally telling from his interest in Glasgow, but indeed will benefit further afield. So really keen to carry on those discussions about what more can be done.
I appreciate the Minister's points on this, and of course I mentioned that 52 CPOs have been pursued by Glasgow City Council, of which 34 have been concluded, but there are of course over 1,600 long-term empty homes in the city, so it gives an idea of the delta in terms of the power and the bandwidth to actually tackle this issue at scale. I think I certainly welcome the opportunity to continue the discussion about how we might achieve the optimum balance in giving local authorities greater power, codifying what Glasgow is already doing as best practice, but expanding Glasgow's capacity as well as other local authorities. maybe disagree with the Minister that there could be the benefit of having it included in the face of the bill in some description. The analogy that I have looked at is in relation to listed buildings. So there is a mechanism within the 1997 Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Scotland Act, that is section 43 and 42. That is a listed buildings repairs notice, maybe analogous to a repairing works notice for any residential property, but that creates an escalation procedure towards a compulsory purchase order. So the explanatory note that Angus Council have published is that the local authority can serve a notice on the owner of a listed building specifying works it considers reasonably necessary for the proper preservation of the building. It is appropriate for consideration when a building is neglected and the need for permanent repair accumulates to the point where there is potential for serious harm. And after a period of not less than 2 months, it appears that reasonable steps are not being taken by the owner for its proper preservation. The local authority can begin compulsory purchase proceedings, and the council can acquire a listed building that is not being properly conserved if this will facilitate its repair either by the council or through an appropriate repairing owner to which it is subsequently passed. So I feel there's a similarity in intent there. That's a statutory measure that councils are able to exercise. They don't exercise it enough, but that's another story. But I think there's a similar mechanism for residential property that's inhabited, where we can create that system of escalation through the repairing works notices that are already in place, but then culminating in a compulsory purchase order, and it creates that formalised system of escalation. But maybe that could be achieved through amended wording, and I'll have to give way.
Thank you. Just very briefly, Mr Sweeney raised this with me in our discussions. I haven't had the time to get advice up on the particular aspects that he raised with me, given it's only been a few days since we had those discussions, but the particular aspect is something I can give him reassurance that I am seeking further advice on to see whether we could work together on something on stage 3 or not, but I'd be happy to get back to the member on that once I've received that advice.
Well, I appreciate the Minister's comments, and certainly I think there is an opportunity here to capture what's been a really good system in Glasgow so far, albeit at a scale that isn't sufficient to address the nature of the housing emergency in the city, but I think it could be potentially an opportunity to put it in a codified way on the bill, and that would allow local authorities the confidence to create a more sophisticated system, and perhaps also underpin it with investment from the government to supercharge the opportunity to do CPOs at scale. It might well tie in with I know the government's looking at a law reform procedure with the CPOs, but I think there is an opportunity in this bill to do something positive that can address the housing emergency in Glasgow and elsewhere. So, thank you.
Thank you. And I'll call Megan. Actually, before I call Megan Gallagher, I'm just going to let people know we have been sitting in our chairs for quite a long time. So I'm going to call Megan, then Jamie Halco-Johnson, any other members at their discretion, and then bring in Maggie to wind up, and then we will go to a break. So just to let people know. So I'll call Megan Gallagher to speak to Amendment 516 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. My amendment deals with the issues that we experience in relation to properties with cladding. We, of course, introduced legislation on the 1st of June 2022 banning combustible facade materials from being used on the outside of residential and high-risk buildings 11 plus metres in height. However, the Building Scotland Amendment regulations of 2022 omitted certain key buildings from the ban, namely hotels and office buildings. This contrasts with what we've seen in relation to legislation in England, where the ban on combustible materials was extended in December 2022 to include hotels, hostels, boarding houses, care homes and other buildings of that nature. High-risk buildings under 11 plus metres in height sit outside of the ban, including schools and hospitals, meaning these buildings can still be constructed or retrofitted with combustible cladding and insulation. Now, we know that there are issues with the standard testing, the BS 8414, that has been widely criticised as being not fit for purpose. However, that is still the testing standard that we use in Scotland to look at buildings that could have the combustible facade materials on them. Now, the Scottish Government have rightly acknowledged the limitations of the system testing when introducing the initial ban. However, given that we've seen minutes from the Building and Fire Safety Ministerial Working Group, such testing appears to underpin the Scottish Government's approach moving forward regarding external wall products. So I think we do need clarification on the Government's position regarding this matter. and whether the government accepts the serious risk associated with the use of combustible facade materials which pass a systems test, because it does seem evident that the confidence within this testing system itself is not one that we should necessarily be using moving forward, and we should be working UK-wide in order to find a solution that we can bring forward here in Scotland. Now, I understand that my amendment does relate to dwellings. I did want to extend the margins of that amendment to include other buildings that are high risk that's associated with combustible facade materials. However, I was advised that I was out with the scope of the bill. However, I do believe that it's all interlinked, and I'll explain why just now. Because we do have, for example, hotels that primarily provide members of the public with a place to sleep, so they serve a purpose with residential domestic properties. Office buildings have also been excluded from the ban, despite a high occupancy and a growing interest, of course, in converting those buildings for residential use. Yes, I will.
Thank you. I hope it reassures Megan Gallagher that although it's not a housing issue, there has been a recent consultation that's discussing extending current provisions on combustible cladding on hotels and similar premises. The consultation closed on the 7th of March, and the responses to that are currently being analysed, with the outcomes will be confirmed this autumn. So I hope that picks up the point out with housing that's been looked at that consultation. And again, I'm sure relevant ministers will keep her informed of that consultation and our government's response to that in due course.
Yes, and I do accept what the Cabinet Secretary is saying, and we have, of course, had the Minister for Housing at committee regarding this exact issue. My concern is, of course, that we are moving significantly slower than our UK counterparts, and I think that's something that does need to be reflected on, particularly that England, as I referenced just earlier, they included those buildings that I've been referencing as part of the ban, and I do think that we should be moving towards this at pace. I understand the consultation, of course, those responses are being analysed. We will probably have an update of this in due course. But as it stands, those buildings can still, any of those buildings that are being retrofitted, renovated, built, can still have that particular building material placed on them. And I think that's something that we do need to take recognition of, particularly if a ban is therefore put in place and we're therefore having to look at those buildings over again. But also, I do believe that there is an issue with schools and hospitals as well. And again, although I'm not talking necessarily about dwellings in terms of housing, this is all encompassed in terms of the overall cladding strategy that I think that we need to move forward and deal with. I don't intend on pressing this amendment today. The Cabinet Secretary will probably be quite pleased to hear that. But I do want to put those issues on the record today, and that was the reason for bringing forward this particular amendment, was to raise the issues of cladding and how much of an urgency there is to actually deal with the issues in relation to combustible facade materials. If I may pick up on just a couple of the other amendments in the group, convener, I do understand that you do want to wrap this up fairly quickly, but I do need to raise concerns in relation to Amendment 249, 385, 538 and 539. There are a number of amendments in this group that will see potentially heavy penalties in respect of where a landlord fails to maintain a property to what is perceived as an accepted standard. But I do believe this plays into a wider issue. SLE, Scottish Land Estates, have raised concerns with the Housing Minister about a key flaw in the bill, and that is the unclear definitions around who the relevant landlord is for providing information. Now, while the Minister's amendments 303, 304 and 313 attempt to address this, they've not resolved the ambiguity over who the person responsible is, where a tenant is also a landlord and the head landlord is the arm's length to the tenancy agreement. So you can see here how the complexities can expand very quickly. The confusion affects compliance with wider housing regulation, including landlord registration and repairing standards. I understand that Scottish Land and Estates have proposed proposed a fix via a clearer definition in the Antisocial Behaviour Scotland Act 2004, which would bring consistency, I hope, across housing regulations, enable clarity for compliance, reduce the likelihood for disputes and therefore delay over repairs, and again provide clarity over the responsible person for enforcement. I think we need to be careful in relation to this grouping of amendments, perhaps whilst well intentioned, wrongly assuming that this clarity already exists. And given that failing to meet the repairing standard can ultimately lead to a criminal offence, isn't it only right that landlords are given clear guidance for what they need to comply with? So will the Cabinet Secretary and Minister commit to introducing further Stage 3 amendments that can deliver this clarity? And I would be more than happy to work on with the Cabinet Secretary. Yes, I will.
Thank Megan Gallagher for giving way. She raises an issue which I know SLE has raised directly with the Minister. He has offered the opportunity to work before Stage 3 to see whether there is something that can be done on this issue. Clearly, it's a very complex issue, as indeed Megan Gallagher has just laid out in but one example of it. So it does require very careful consideration and potentially multiple changes in multiple pieces of law. But that is the reason why the Minister is keen to carry on that conversation with SLE, and of course we'd be happy to do so with Megan Gallagher directly as well.
I do greatly appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's clarity regarding that, and I think that will reassure those who are concerned about the nature of the amendments, not the intent behind them, of course, but again talking about those complexities and how it could have knock-on effects elsewhere. I think we need to make sure that we're looking at this in the round. I think that's relevant when we're talking about Awab's law amendments in relation to that particular legislation as well, that we're making sure that the scope of it, and we're encompassing everything in relation to whether it be the other hazards, whether it be consulting the private rented sector, looking at all of these in the round, and I very much look forward to taking part in those conversations. I'll leave my comments there, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And I now call Jamie Halker-Johnson to speak to Amendment 552 and any other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. You'll be delighted to know that I'll just focus on my amendments 552 and 555, which are particularly pertinent to my Highlands and Islands region. I was very pleased to lead opposition in this Parliament to the Scottish Government's ban on wood-burning stoves in new-build homes in Scotland. And as we held a members' business on the issue, which was supported by MSPs from across the Parliament, bar perhaps one party, but it recognised the importance of wood-burning stoves to households in rural and island communities across the Highlands and Islands that I represent, especially in emergencies or when power is lost, as is too often the case. We also highlighted in that debate, or it was highlighted repeatedly in the debate, the role that they can play in helping alleviate some of the worst impacts of fuel poverty for households. And that's, again, an issue particularly in the Northern Isles where I live, and fuel poverty rates are obviously far too high. And I was very pleased when we forced or encouraged the Scottish Government to look again at this and U-turn on what was a potentially impactful and potentially dangerous ban, particularly for my region. However, there remains the risk that such a ban could be reintroduced, and so my amendments would mean that when considering the regulation of direct emission heating systems which provide secondary heating, such as obviously wood-burning stoves or other forms of emergency heating, there should be a presumption in favour of allowing those heating systems to be installed in any dwellings in remote, rural and island areas. I believe that this will provide both the clarity and the reassurance for my constituents and others who live in those kind of communities, but particularly mine in the Highlands and Islands. When the power goes out or their mains heating breaks, they won't be left in the cold. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Would any other members wish to speak? No. Maggie Chapman to wind up. Press or withdraw Amendment 257.
Thank you very much, Convener. This has been a thorough and wide-ranging but productive discussion, I think, and I've listened carefully to the Cabinet Secretary and to MSP colleagues. There's clear cross-party agreement on the need to improve quality of homes, regardless of what sector they're in. Our homes are the foundation of our health and well-being, and too often they make renters ill. There might be direct physical health consequences of poor quality homes that have mould and damp, as we've heard, but also negative impacts and effects on mental health, on confidence, and on so much more, as Emma Roddick and others have highlighted. I can't see a justification for different approaches between the private and social sectors. Quality matters regardless of tenure and sector. And there's clearly a need for people such as migrant agricultural workers to have healthy, decent places to live in too. So I'm grateful for those issues being aired. It's something that I've come across repeatedly in the North East region. I do, however, remain unconvinced that the current systems, despite the Cabinet Secretary's assurances that the current systems for ensuring quality are working. If they were working well, we wouldn't see the levels of failure against the standards that we see. We need better and more unified standards, proper checks on properties, penalties where these are not being met, timescales for substandard properties to be remedied, and amendments from Greens and others would have helped us towards that. I am, as Graham Simpson said earlier, not trying to be awkward, but because these issues, I think, are of such grave importance to renters and to their advocacy groups, I will close there, convener, but I will press my amendment 257. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 257 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No, we're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 257? And those against? The result of the division on Amendment 257 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. And as I said earlier, we're going to move to a break, a 10-minute break, and I suspend for that time. Okay, welcome back. And we're going to be running through a good few votes now. And I call Amendment 565 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 218. Mark Griffin, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not move. Call Amendment 335 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 335 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed. I call Amendment 65 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 281. Graham Simpson, to move or not move?
That's not moved.
Not. I call Amendment 228 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with Amendment 220 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with Amendment 218. Alexander Stewart, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 228 be agreed. Sorry, I don't know why I keep doing that. Dyslexia. The question is that Amendment 220 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 220 and those against? The result of the division on Amendment 220 is 4 for and 3 against. The amendment has been agreed. I call Amendment 36 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 336, 337 and 338, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated with Amendment 281. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 336 to 338 en bloc. Does any member object to a single question being put? Oh, sorry.
Moved on block.
Thank you. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 336 to 338? No objection. The question is that Amendments 336 to 338 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I'm just checking if I was agreed. I call Amendment 138 in the name of Emma Roddick, already debated with Amendment 218. And I remind members that Amendments 138 and 161 are direct alternatives. That is, they can both be moved and decided on. The text of whichever is the last agreed to is what will appear in the bill. Emma Roddick, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 161 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 339 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendments 281. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 339 be agreed. Are we all agreed? 339, let me just check. Yes. Call Amendment 340 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 340 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 201 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 341 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 341 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 342 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 342 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 494 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 494 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 494? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 494 is 2 for and 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 343 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 343 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 344 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 344 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 495 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 495 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 495? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 495 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 345 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 345 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 496 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 496 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 496? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 496 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 139 in the name of Emma Roddick, already debated with Amendment 218. Emma Roddick to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 238 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 346 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 346 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 347 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 347 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 497 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 497 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There'll be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 497? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 497 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 348 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 348 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. Call Amendment 498 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 498 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 498? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 498 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 349 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 349 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 499 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 499 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 499? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 499 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 140 in the name of Emma Roddick, already debated with Amendment 218. Emma Roddick to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 239 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 37 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. And I remind members that if Amendment 37 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 162, 202, 350, 351, 240 and 352, debated in groups rent-controlled areas, amount of rent cap and rent increase procedures due to preemption. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
No, not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 162 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 202 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 350 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 350 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 351 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 251 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 240 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 218. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 352 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 352 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 38 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 39 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 40 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 41 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 353 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 281. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 353 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 42 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 43 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 66 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 281. Graham Simpson to move or not move?
Not moved.
Right, 67. I just need to keep track of where I'm voting. I call Amendment 67 in the name of Graham Simpson. Already debated with Amendment 281. Graham Simpson to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 68 in the name of Graham Simpson. Already debated with Amendment 281. Graham Simpson to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 114 in the name of Megan Gallagher. Already debated with Amendment 85. Megan Gallagher to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 114 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 114? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 114 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. We're now going to move on to the next grouping, which is information to tenants. And I call Amendment 354 in the name of the Minister, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I remind members of the preemptions in this group as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 354 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. In a rent control area, a landlord will be prevented from increasing the rent under a private residential tenancy for the property more than once in a 12-month period, even if a new tenancy is granted in that time. Accordingly, tenants considering enter into a lease in a rent control area should have the information that they need to make informed decisions about renting a property. The Scottish Government therefore have brought forward amendments 354 to 361 in relation to information that landlords must include in rental adverts for properties in rent control areas unless those properties are exempt from rent control. Together, Amendments 355 and 358 will ensure that information about rent increases in the previous 12-month period and the most recent rent payable for the property is available to tenants looking to rent in a rent control area. This will help the tenant to understand the earliest date on which their rent can be increased and is an essential part of ensuring the rent cap is applied correctly between tenancies. Amendment 360 will help a landlord to understand whether a previous rent increase is a relevant rent increase for the purposes of these advertisement requirements. This will also support the provision of the correct information in adverts. Amendments 356, 357 and 359 require the advert to highlight to prospective tenants that the rent at the start of the lease may be different from the rent specified in the advert if there is a variation in the percentage change in CPI before the start of this lease. This change is necessary in consequence of the amendments debated under Group 5 to set out a CPI-based rent cap formula in the bill. These amendments will enhance the effective operation of the rent control measures in the bill and will ensure that tenants have the right information they need in order to exercise their rights and make informed decisions about taking on a tenancy. Amendment 422 in the name of Mark Griffin would require the provision of an inventory to all tenants before the tenancy commences. Provision of inventories is already common practice within the private rented sector, and in instances where a letting agent deals with a tenancy check-in, a requirement under the Code of Practice, unless otherwise agreed in writing by the landlord. The Scottish Government's Easy Read notes, which must accompany the PRT Model Tenancy Agreement, encourages landlords and tenants to create a detailed written inventory and schedule of condition at tenancy commencement. The need for a statutory requirement, therefore, is unclear. In addition, while it is in the best interest of tenants and landlords for an inventory to be completed, there would be difficulties forcing any mandatory requirement. I therefore ask the member not to press. Turning to Amendments 247 and 248 in the name of Daniel Johnston, which would require private landlords under a private residential tenancy and social landlords under a social tenancy to provide tenants with information on the rent payable in each of the previous 36 months. While I recognise the calls for improved data to be available on rents, these amendments are not necessary. For the private rented sector, information on the previous rent payable is only required by tenants where a rent control area is in place and would be unnecessary for other tenants. We have already made provision as part of rent control measures and through our own amendments to ensure tenants have the information they need to know, such as when the first rent increase might take place. This will allow them to consider whether they want to take the tenancy on or not. Where a tenancy is not within a rent control area, increases in rent are restricted to once in a 12-month period, and amendments would prevent rent increases within the first 12 months of the tenancy. In addition, Section 11 of the 2016 Act already allow ministers to impose a duty on landlords or prospective landlords to provide the tenant with information as specified in regulations, should this be required in the future. Turning to the social rented sector, information on rents is already publicly available for tenants and prospective tenants on the Social Housing Regulator's website within their landlord comparison tool. This enables a tenant or anyone with an interest to check the average rent of different sizes of landlords' homes from 2014-15 onwards. Information on the regulator's annual reports for each landlord also includes the average weekly percentage rent increase for each year. Social rented sector tenants also have a right under the 2001 Act to request information on their landlord's policy and procedure in relation to the setting of rent and other charges, and the landlord has to provide this. Therefore, these amendments are not required, and I ask the member not to press. Amendment 273, in the name of Maggie Chapman, seeks to introduce additional information that a landlord must provide to tenants alongside their written terms of tenancy before the day on which a new tenancy commences. I agree that it is vital that tenants are aware of and empowered to utilise their rights, including having access to relevant information that may affect their tenancy. There are already existing statutory requirements that require specified information to be provided by the landlord free of charge to tenants at the point their tenancy commences. In addition, there are existing regulation-making powers in the 2016 Act that enable ministers to set out further information that must be provided by a landlord to a tenant. In my view, it is more appropriate to use these existing powers than to insert new requirements on the face of this bill. Sure.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I hear what she says about the existing powers and guidance that we have, but it's become very, very clear that many tenants don't actually know the full range of their rights, and that landlords are not providing them with this information as you indicate they should, according to the 2016 Act and other requirements. So I'm wondering what the Scottish Government is intending to do to ensure that actually we can strengthen those provisions or ensure that there is compliance by landlords.
Without putting even further pressure on the work that we're about to do over the summer, when we're talking about, for example, repairs and the works that are going on around standards over the summer, to see what needs to be done, I think an important part out of that will come whether it requires changes in primary legislation, secondary legislation, or can be done using non-legislative manners that we've spoken about before, about improving the knowledge of people's rights. When it comes to aspects such as these, I think it is important that we do think about what it is more important and more useful to have in secondary legislation, which, as the member knows, is much easier to change over time as circumstances and events and requirements change, either to add or to take away, depending on what happens in the future. And that's why in these aspects I would suggest the secondary legislation is more an appropriate mechanism for that. Convener, alongside these points, our current consultation includes consideration of information that landlords should be required to give to tenants in situations where the property is either exempt or where an increase above the level of the rent cap is permitted. I would therefore urge Maggie Chapman not to press these amendments, but I would again be happy to work with her ahead of stage 3 to ensure that the concerns that she's raised about how we use the existing powers to maximum effect to ensure tenants are given relevant information and are aware of their rights is taken forward. Amendment 274 in the name of Maggie Chapman would require a social landlord to provide information to a tenant about the ability to join a tenants' union before they sign their tenancy agreement. I understand Maggie Chapman's wish to have this amendment supported across both the private rented sector and social rented sector. However, in legislative terms, the two sectors are very different in that social housing tenants since 2001 have a statutory right to tenant participation with their landlord, and this was further strengthened by the introduction of the Scottish Social Housing Charter in 2012. Accordingly, I can't support Amendments 273 and 274 as they are already provided for in statute and in guidance. I would therefore urge committee members to support the amendments 354 to 361 in this group, and if pressed, not to support Mark Griffin, Daniel Johnson and Maggie Chapman's amendments in this group for the reasons I've set out. And I move Amendment 354.
Thank you. And now call Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 422 and other amendments in the group.
Agree an inventory on the day the tenancy starts. Providing an agreed inventory at the beginning of the tenancy would be beneficial for landlords and tenants alike. Not only does it help to ensure that the property is returned back to its owner in the original condition prior to renting out, but it also reduces the risk of deposit disputes arising at the end of the tenancy. Tenants are also more likely to have their deposit returned in full if what is expected of them is made clear at the start of the lease. In case there is a disagreement over the return of the deposit, an inventory can be used as evidence in a dispute to prove the condition of the property prior to tenants moving in. Overall, this amendment serves to ensure that information and communication between a landlord and a tenant is as full and clear as possible, which can contribute towards a good relationship between the two and, in the worst case scenario, ensures that disputes are resolved using agreed evidence that can be referred back to. On Amendments 247 and 248, in my colleague Daniel Johnson's name, 247 places duties on landlords to provide information on previous 36 months of rental payments to tenants before the tenancy commences, and Amendment 248 replicates that for Scottish secure tenancy. These amendments were to complement amendments in a previous group where rents substantially fell behind market rate as a result of not being increased over a period of time. This was to complement those packages to give incoming tenants assurance over what had happened over previous years, so that they could be persuaded that the increase back to market level wasn't off the back of previous rent increases. But since those areas are intended to be covered in the consultation on exemptions, then Daniel Dawson doesn't plan to press this complementary suite of amendments 247 248. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks for covering Daniel Johnson's amendments there as well. Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 273 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. Rent controls will only work if tenants are aware of their rights. With rent control areas covering some parts of the country but not others, we have to ensure that how a rent control impacts or affects tenants is communicated very clearly to them. That's what my Amendment 273 does. It requires the landlord to say whether or not the property is covered by a rent cap. This is not covered by existing legislation or guidance, as rent controls don't currently exist. So, according to this amendment, landlords should provide this information to their tenants, as well as advertising to them their right to join a tenants' union and their other rights under the Private Sector Charter being introduced by Rachel Hamilton, which we also support. Amendment 274 is a minor amendment which applies the tenants' union provisions to the social rented sector as well. Tenants' unions, like Living Rent and others, have been a driving force for fairer private rented sector for years. They've challenged landlords who neglected their tenants and their properties. They've won hundreds of thousands of pounds in rent cuts and other payments for renters, and they've ensured much delayed repairs are actually done. Landlords who are compliant with the law and interested in supporting their tenants, as we are being assured many are, should not be concerned that their tenants will know they can unionise from day one of their tenancy. Turning to other amendments in this group, I also support amendments 422, 247 and 248 from Mark Griffin and Daniel Johnson. They will empower tenants and, in the case of 422, will ensure protections for both the landlord and tenants by making what is currently best practice in agreeing inventories into a statutory duty, and we believe that it should be statutory. Thank you.
Do any other members wish to speak? Megan Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's on the amendments 273 and 274. I understand exactly what Maggie Chapman's attempting to do with these amendments, but I don't think the landlord providing the tenant with information on the ability to join a tenant union is as clear cut as it might look on paper. I think there might be issues in relation to how that information is conveyed. We're living in a digital world now. Would that need to be done through emailing? Would it be done in physical? I think all of these things would need to be worked out even before we would begin to discuss these issues. And I would just be a little bit concerned in relation to tabling this to not actually understand exactly what would be required of the landlord to do and how to do it. And of course, how would the union, how would the member be able to join the union, I think would be another issue that would need to be resolved. I think there's a lot more information here rather than just looking at the amendment in situ. Yes, I certainly will.
So I hear what Megan Gallagher is saying. However, I think in terms of the information about how to join, and that would be up to the renter, up to the tenant to find out. Just as like in employment terms, there are a whole range of opportunities, there's a lot of information that is provided to a new employee. The mechanism of providing that information isn't necessarily laid out in statute anywhere. It's just saying that this information will be provided, including you can join a union, a workers' union, and a trade union. And that's exactly the same principle here. There isn't the information about how you would join, which one you would choose, how you would go about actually doing that. But it's about having the information for the renter, in this case, that these unions exist, that they are available. And I'm not sure we do actually need to put into statute on the face of the bill exactly how that would happen, how that communication would happen, given as you've suggested yourself, communication mechanisms change all the time. Mm-hmm. It's requiring landlords to make that information available to renters, because at the moment there is so much information out there that just isn't communicated. So this would ensure that the landlord has that requirement to do so, but would do so in a way that worked for that situation.
No, I thank Maggie Chapman for the intervention there. I'm still a little bit unclear as to how that would work in practice, because again, you're saying there that it wouldn't necessarily be about which ones to join, all of the rest of it. Then I do believe that there should be some duty on the tenant as well to look into that matter. I think it works both ways, and I think that's the point that I'm perhaps looking at here. I know we might have a disagreement on that, but I think there needs to be onus on perhaps both in that instance, instead of it just being on one side of that situation.
Can I come back? Just very, very briefly, I think you can't look into something if you don't know it exists. And this is about providing the information to the tenant that that unions exist at all. And then, as you say, the tenant needs to go and do their own homework and explore which one might be right for them, if indeed they choose to do so. But if they don't know they exist in the first place, they can't explore which one to join.
I take what Maggie Chapman is saying, but no, I do understand what you're saying and what you're trying to do, but I do believe still on the basis that there should be onus on both sides, perhaps not just on one side, because I do think that the people will be aware that unions exist for a number of different reasons, and therefore that could be looked into by the tenant themselves. And again, you know, by just saying yes, you can join a union, it's not really giving them much scope in terms of which ones that they would maybe want to. I just think that that information could be better sourced elsewhere is probably what the argument that I'm getting to. But I understand the exchange and what Maggie Chapman's trying to achieve with this amendment. I think that was the point that I was looking for a little bit of clarity on, convener, but I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Minister, to wind up.
Thank you, Convener. Very little to say in terms of winding up, but I do recognise that we will need to undertake awareness raising of new rights and changes as part of the implementation for this Act, should it pass through Parliament, as well as updating tenancy documents and information, and that clearly further signposting can be provided at this point. So Maggie Chapman, although I do not agree with her amendments, I think she raises a very important point about ensuring a tenant has the right information, that in an appropriate timeframe, and that will be an important part of the work that we will need to look at on implementation of the Act.
The question is that Amendment 354 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of the amendment? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 354 is 6-4-1 against. The division has not been agreed. Has been agreed. I call Amendment 44 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29, and I remind members that if Amendment 44 is agreed, I cannot call Amendments 355 and 356 debated in the group information to tenants because of preemption. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendments 355 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 355 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 356 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 356 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 357 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 357 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Call Amendment 45 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29, and I remind members that if Amendment 45 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 358, debated in group information to tenants due to preemption. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 358 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 358 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 46 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 29. Willie Rennie to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 359 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 359 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call Amendment 360 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 360 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 115 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with Amendment 85. And I remind members that if Amendment 115 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 361, debated in group information to tenants due to preemption. Megan Gallagher to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 115 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 115? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 115 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. Call Amendment 361 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 354. Minister to move formally.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 361 be agreed. Are we all agreed? I call Amendment 500 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 214. Mark Griffin to move or not move.
Not moved.
I call Amendment 501 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 214. Mark Griffin to move or not move.
Not moved.
I call Amendment 116 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with Amendment 85. Megan Gallagher to move or not move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 116 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 116? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 116 is 2 for, 4 against, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 229 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 214. Maggie Chapman to move or not move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 229 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 229? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 229 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 117 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with Amendment 85. Megan Gallagher to move or not move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 117 be agreed. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We're not agreed. There'll be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 117? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 117 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 118 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with Amendment 85. Megan Gallagher to move or not move.
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 118 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 118 and those against. The result of the division on Amendment 118 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 258 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 214. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 258 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be an amendment. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 258? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 258 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 69 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 203. Graham Simpson to move or not move.
Not moved.
Okay, that concludes that bit of voting, and we are now. Are we going to go on? Yeah. Okay, so we're now going to move on to a new grouping, which is reviews and reports. And I call Amendment 70 in the name of Graham Simpson, grouped with Amendments 71, 72, 226 and 76. Graham Simpson to move Amendment 70 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I'll move Amendment 70 in my name. Now, you would think that a group entitled Reviews and Reports wouldn't be too controversial. I'm sure it won't be. I'm really sure it won't be, although the Cabinet Secretary may have different ideas. We'll wait to see. So Amendment 70 This would require ministers to review and report on the provisions in Part 1 of the bill, which relate to rent control, of course, every 5 years. The Minister of Housing has already felt the need to review and consult on the rent control aspects of the bill at stage 1. That created some uncertainty. And there are also some concerns about data collection restrictions impeding councils from using the powers contained in this legislation effectively. In fact, Robin Blacklock from Dowbray told this committee, quotes, "I have a real fear that we'll be reviewing and amending the bill in 5 years' time because we do not have the data." Given these concerns, proper progress monitoring and reporting will be required. So I'm putting a 5-yearly deadline on the Scottish Government in this particular amendment. Better monitoring and reporting would maintain transparency and accountability for all stakeholders and investors. So that's Amendment 70. Now, you wouldn't think that's awfully complicated or controversial. We'll wait and see what the Cabinet Secretary has to say. But moving on to Amendment 71, and this I would call the Graham Simpson taking leave of his senses amendment, because this would give ministers the power to make any provisions they consider appropriate for the purposes of providing an effective rent control framework, including modifying this or any other act. So members can look as horrified as they wish at that one. I don't know what I was thinking of, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary doesn't either, and I'll leave it at that. Moving on to Amendment 72, this just sets out the procedures for ministers modifying the Act. The pre-laying procedure includes laying a copy of the proposed regulations before Parliament, with a statement setting out their reasons for proposing them and specifying a period for representations on the proposed regulations to be made. And Amendment 76 just attaches the affirmative procedure to the regulations under Amendment 71, which gives ministers the power to make any provisions as I outlined earlier. So I think you can probably ignore that one as well. And I shall leave it at that. Nice short group.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on Rachel Hamilton, but I believe that Alexandra Stewart is going to speak on her behalf to Amendment 226 and other amendments in the group.
Happy to speak to Amendment 226. 226 would introduce a full-range impact assessment of the provisions of the Housing Bill on rural and island communities. It is too late to legislate impact assessments into the bill, which would have been very welcome given the Scottish Government's track record. Rural and island communities face fundamentally different housing challenges, and a one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. In areas of housing delivery, it is already constrained by limited infrastructure, high builder costs and lack of available land. Policies designed for urban centres, however well-intentioned, have a limited impact, and rural settings from stalling developments from making less viable and homes less viable to rent or to build. As highlighted by Property Mark, applying a rural impact assessment to the bill could ensure that it enhances the rural sector rather than adversely causing harm. Without a clear understanding of how the housing bill will affect rural or island areas, we risk deepening the rural-urban divide in housing access, affordability and opportunity. Scotland's Land and Estates have rightly noted that it is particularly difficult for full impact of housing or may not be able in rural and island areas across Scotland. The private rented sector, homelessness, fuel poverty all exhibit different characteristics across the region of Scotland, and for the impact of the housing bill it would be fully understood. A rural and island impact assessment would ensure that the bill supports rather than hinders housing in communities. It would also give policymakers the evidence they need to tailor solutions that work not just in cities but across the whole of Scotland. This is not about specific treatment or special treatment. It is about fair treatment, and it is essential that we want to ensure that housing system is truly served for all of Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Would do any other members wish to speak? Minister.
Thank you, Convener. As the committee is already aware, the bill sets out that any designation of a rent control area will apply for a period of 5 years, and Section 11 of the bill requires ministers to keep rent control areas under review to ensure they remain necessary and proportionate. We realise that it will be crucial for Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament more widely to keep under review the impact of the bill on the private rented sector, and this is particularly important when it comes to the impact of the rent control measures that we have brought forward. While I do have some concerns about the specific details in the amendments that have come forward, I would be willing ahead of Stage 3 to look at how we can put a requirement to report on the impact of the rent control measures in the bill on a legislative footing. Graham Simpson's Amendment 70 would create a duty on Scottish ministers to review the operation of the rent control measures of the bill every 5 years, particularly in relation to its impact on the rental market and housing affordability, to publish a report on the review and to lay that report before Parliament. I agree with the principle of monitoring the impact of Part 1 of the bill, and I think Graham Simpson's proposal to do so on a 5-yearly basis is broadly in line with the local authority assessment process and is therefore a very sensible one. However, I do have some concerns about the specific drafting of his amendment in this group due to the inflexible nature of the statutory duties they set out. In particular, I have very real concerns about Mr Simpson's Amendments 71, 72 and 76, which are consequential and would confer a very broad, some may say sweeping power, to the Scottish ministers to modify any act in relation to the outcome of the review. I do not consider that such broad powers are proportionate. The rent control measures set out in the bill have been designed to include the flexibility to modify various aspects of the regime where this is necessary and proportionate, but such broad powers would create uncertainty and have a negative impact on future investment, which we all agree is so vital. However, I do want to work with Graham Simpson on this issue, and my offer is to work with him on a Stage 3 amendment that incorporates his proposal in Amendment 70 for a 5-yearly reporting requirement. I cannot support the associated wide-ranging powers to modify legislation that he has proposed, but I hope he would be willing to take up my offer to work with him and we can find something more proportionate. On that basis, I would urge Graham Simpson not to press the amendments. Amendment 226, in the name of Rachel Hamilton, would require Scottish ministers to conduct an impact assessment of the provisions of this Act on rural and island communities no later than 12 months after royal assent. Whilst I am supportive of Rachel Hamilton's focus on rural areas, I believe the measures in the bill will support all areas across Scotland. As we have, of course, already published a suite of documents to support the introduction of this bill that set out our assessment of impacts from the measures, and these have been brought forward, and this would seem to be relevant to the intent behind this amendment. But I do recognise the benefit of monitoring the impact of the measures in the bill once they are implemented, particularly on rural landlords. However, an assessment that requires to be carried out whilst the measures are still in process of being implemented, as would be the case under the terms of this specific amendment, would be administratively burdensome. I would be more supportive of reporting on the impacts on the rural sector as part of our overall assessment of the rent controls under the bill on a 5-yearly basis. So I would therefore aim to ensure that the amendment that I hope to agree with Mr Simpson ahead of Stage 3 would also address the underlying principle that Rachel Hamilton has quite rightly brought forward today. On that basis, I cannot support Amendment 226 and would urge members not to support Rachel Hamilton's amendment if it is indeed pressed. Thank you, Convener.
Graham Simpson to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 70.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think I'll get out while the going is good, and the Cabinet, with the Cabinet Secretary calling my Amendment 70 sensible. I'll take that, and I will certainly work with her, not for the first time, on this ahead of Stage 3, so I won't press it.
Okay, thank you. Graham Simpson is seeking to withdraw Amendment 70. Does any member object to the amendment being withdrawn? There are no objections, so the amendment has been withdrawn. Call Amendment 71 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 70. Graham Simpson to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 72 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 70. Graham Simpson to move or not move?
Not moved.
Call Amendment 451 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 214. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 451 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 451? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 451 is 2 for, 5 against. The amendment has been disagreed. I call Amendment 186 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 148. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 186 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 186? Those against? So we just do that again. Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 186 is 1 for, 6 against. The amendment has been disagreed. Okay, here we go. I call amendments 427, 428, 429, 430, 431, 432, 433, 434, 435, 436, 437, 438 and 439, all in the name of Edward Mountain and all previously debated. And I invite Megan Gallagher to move amendments 427 to 439 en bloc.
Move.
Does any member object to a single question being put on amendments 427 to 439? Yes, I object. Okay, so where am I going? Okay, I call amendment 427. Okay. The question is that amendment 427 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of amendment 427? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 427 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 428 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 428? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 428 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 429 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. All those in favour of Amendment 429? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 429 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 4... Yes, you moved them all en bloc.
But then I thought there was a disagreement to that.
Yes, so the disagreement was around a single question being put. So Okay, now I'm confused. 4:30. Right, okay. The question is that Amendment 430 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 430? Those against? Abstentions. Oh, abstentions? Sorry. The result of the division on Amendment 430 is 1 for, 4 against, and 2 abstentions. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 431 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 431? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 431 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 432 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 432? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 432 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 433 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 433? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 433 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 434 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 434? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 434 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 435 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 435? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 435 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 436 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 436? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 436 is 3 for and 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 437 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 437? Those against? The result of the division on Amendment 437 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. The question is that Amendment 438 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of 438? All those against? The result of the division on Amendment 438 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. And the question is that Amendment 439 be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a division. All those in favour of Amendment 439? Those against? Okay. The result of the division on Amendment 439 is 3 for, 4 against. The amendment has been disagreed. That's it. Is that back to the script? Yeah. Okay. We're going to end our work for the day there. I wish to thank members, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. That concludes our meeting for today, and our next meeting will continue consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill at stage 3. And we will also... Oh, sorry, stage 2. Wishful thinking. And for members, we will also consider our annual report at the next meeting. For now, thank you. I close the meeting.